Hello everyone and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we delve into a case that shocked the quiet suburbs of Illinois in September 2023. A story of deception, manipulation, and tragedy that unfolded in the most unexpected ways. This is the story of the Romeoville family murders. In the spring of 2023, Alberto Rolón and Zoraida Bartolome were living what many would consider the American dream. Alberto, 38, was a hard-working man who had built a stable life for his family. Zoraida, 32, was a devoted mother who balanced her career with raising their two precious boys. 9-year-old Adriel was bright and curious, always asking questions about the world around him. 7-year-old Diego was the family's little comedian, bringing laughter to their household with his infectious smile. The family had just achieved a major milestone, purchasing their first home together. In April 2023, they moved into their new house on Concord Avenue in Romeoville's Hampton Park subdivision. It was a modest but comfortable home in a safe neighborhood, the kind of place where children could play in the front yard and parents could sleep peacefully at night. The house represented everything they had worked for, a symbol of their success and a foundation for their children's future. Zoraida was particularly proud of their new beginning. She would often post pictures on social media of the family settling into their new space, decorating rooms and making memories. The boys had their own bedrooms for the first time, and there was a backyard where their 3 beloved dogs could run and play. It was everything a young family could want. But beneath this picture of domestic bliss, something sinister was brewing. Unbeknownst to Alberto and the children, Zoraida had become involved in a relationship that would ultimately destroy everything she held dear. At her workplace, she had begun an affair with a coworker, a man named Nathaniel Huey Jr. Nathaniel Huey Jr. was 31 years old, but his life had taken a very different path than Zoraida's. While she was building a family and achieving stability, Huey had accumulated a lengthy criminal record. Court documents would later reveal that he had multiple arrests and convictions, including charges that should have prevented him from legally possessing firearms. Despite these red flags, he had managed to maintain employment and, more dangerously, had entered into a romantic relationship with a woman named Ermelinda Palomo. Palomo, 22 years old, seemed like an unlikely figure to become the architect of such devastating violence. To those who knew her casually, she appeared to be a typical young woman navigating modern relationships and life challenges. But beneath her ordinary exterior lay a mind capable of extraordinary manipulation and deception. The affair between Huey and Zoraida had been going on for some time, hidden from both Alberto and Ermelinda, but secrets have a way of surfacing. And when Ermelinda discovered the betrayal, her reaction would set in motion a chain of events that no one could have anticipated. When Ermelinda Palomo learned of her fiancé's affair with Zoraida Bartolome, she didn't confront the situation directly. Instead, she began to craft an elaborate web of lies and manipulation that would prove to be deadly. Rather than ending the relationship or demanding honesty, Palomo chose a path of calculated deception that would exploit Huey's criminal past and his paranoid tendencies. Understanding that Huey already lived with the constant anxiety that comes from a life of crime, Palomo began to feed his fears. She started telling him that dangerous people were after him, specifically that violent drug runners had discovered his relationship with Zoraida and were planning to harm him. She painted vivid pictures of the threats they faced, creating a sense of urgency and danger that existed only in her imagination. The manipulation was sophisticated and psychologically crafted. Palomo knew exactly which buttons to push to make Huey believe that his life was in immediate danger. She told him that these mysterious threats weren't just aimed at him, but at Zoraida as well. In Huey's paranoid mindset, already shaped by years of looking over his shoulder, these fabricated threats seemed entirely plausible. But Palomo's manipulation went even deeper. She convinced Huey that the only way to protect himself and Zoraida from these imaginary drug runners was to eliminate the threat entirely. In her twisted logic, she argued that the entire family needed to be killed to prevent them from being used against Huey. She even convinced him that the children would be better off dead than alive without parents. A phrase that would later haunt investigators when Huey confessed it to his mother. The psychological manipulation was so complete that Huey genuinely believed he was acting in protection rather than aggression. This delusion would drive him to commit acts of violence that, in his distorted reality, seemed like acts of mercy and self-defense. In the days leading up to the tragedy, there were signs that something terrible was about to happen, though no one recognized them at the time. Huey's behavior became increasingly erratic. He spoke to family members about people being after him and expressed fears that seemed disproportionate to any real threat. Meanwhile, Paloma was busy ensuring that the plan she had set in motion would come to fruition. She didn't just plant the ideas in Huey's mind, she actively participated in the logistics of what was about to unfold. Phone records would later show extensive communication between the couple in the days before the murders, as Palomo continued to reinforce the false narrative that had consumed Huey's thoughts. On the evening of September 16, 2023, the Roland Bartolome family went about their normal routine. Alberto likely helped the boys with homework or played with them in the backyard. Zoraida may have prepared dinner, checked on the children's school preparations for the next day, and settled the family dogs for the night. It was a typical Saturday evening in suburban America, filled with the ordinary moments that make up a life. None of them could have known that just a few miles away, Nathaniel Huey Jr. was preparing to drive to their home with murder on his mind, believing that he was about to save lives rather than take them. In the early morning hours of September 17th, 2023, at approximately 3:17 a.m., surveillance cameras captured a chilling scene. Ermelinda Palomo drove Nathaniel Huey Jr. to the Roland family's home on Concord Avenue. The footage, which would later become crucial evidence, showed Palomo not as a victim or an unwilling participant, but as an active accomplice in what was about to unfold. The house was quiet and dark. Alberto and Zoraida were asleep in their bedroom, exhausted from their week of work and parenting. Down the hall, 9-year-old Adriel and 7-year-old Diego were sleeping peacefully in their rooms, surrounded by the toys and belongings that marked their childhood. Even the family's 3 dogs were settled for the night, unaware that danger was approaching their home. What happened next was swift and merciless. Huey entered the house and systematically shot every member of the family. The evidence would later show that this wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was an execution, carried out with cold precision. Alberto, Zoraida, Adriel, and Diego were all shot to death in their own home, the place that was supposed to be their sanctuary. But the violence didn't stop with the family members. In a particularly disturbing aspect of the crime, Huey also killed all 3 of the family's dogs. This detail would later help investigators understand the calculated nature of the crime. The killing of pets in a domestic homicide often indicates a perpetrator who is methodical and wants to eliminate any potential witnesses or complications. Even innocent animals. The entire horrific event likely lasted only minutes. By the time the sun rose on September 17, 2023, an entire family had been wiped out, their dreams and futures stolen in an act of violence that served no purpose beyond satisfying one person's desire for revenge and control. The bodies weren't discovered immediately. The family's absence might not have been noticed for days, if not for the concern of people who knew them. When someone requested a welfare check, Romeoville police officers responded to the home on Concord Avenue, not knowing what they would find inside. The scene that greeted the officers was one of absolute devastation. What should have been a home filled with the sounds of family life, children getting ready for school, parents preparing for work, dogs barking for attention, was instead silent and still. The discovery of 4 family members and 3 pets, all victims of gun violence, sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community and launched one of the most intensive investigations in Romeoville's history. First responders, many of whom had families of their own, were deeply affected by the scene. The sight of children's bedrooms turned into crime scenes, of toys scattered among evidence markers, of a home that had so recently been filled with love and laughter, now serving as a tomb. These images would stay with the investigators throughout the case. The community reaction was immediate and intense. Hampton Park subdivision, where families had felt safe letting their children play outside and where neighbors knew each other by name, was suddenly gripped by fear and uncertainty. If such violence could happen to the Roland Bartolome family, seemingly without warning or reason, who was safe? Within hours of the discovery, Romeoville police had launched a full-scale investigation. The methodical nature of the crime suggested this wasn't a random act of violence, and investigators immediately began looking for connections between the victims and potential suspects. It didn't take long for Nathaniel Huey Jr.'s name to surface. His relationship with Zoraida, combined with his criminal history, made him a person of interest almost immediately. When investigators tried to locate him for questioning, they discovered that he had disappeared, along with his fiancée, Ermelinda Palomo. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the local level. Phone records, tollway records, license plate recognition cameras, and vehicle infotainment systems all began providing pieces of the puzzle. Modern technology, which had initially helped the perpetrators plan and execute their crime, now became the tool that would track them down. As investigators dug deeper into the case, they began to uncover the complex web of relationships and deceptions that had led to the murders. The affair between Huey and Zoraida was documented through phone records and witness statements. Cal workers came forward with information about the relationship, providing investigators with a timeline and context for what had happened. But the more investigators learned, the more questions arose. Why had Huey killed not just Zoraida, but her entire family? What had driven him to such extreme violence? And where were he and Palomo now? While police were building their case against Huey, he and Palomo had fled Illinois. What followed was a multi-state manhunt that captured national attention. The couple's flight from justice was documented through various surveillance systems as they made their way across state lines. During this time, Palomo's family filed an endangered missing person report. They believed, based on the information available to them, that she had been taken against her will and was in danger. This added another layer of complexity to the investigation, as authorities had to consider whether Palomo was a victim or a co-conspirator. The answer would come through careful analysis of phone records, surveillance footage, and witness statements. Rather than being a victim, the evidence increasingly pointed to Palomo as the mastermind behind the entire plot. Her manipulation of Huey, her active participation in driving him to the murder scene, and her flight from justice all painted a picture of someone who was deeply involved in planning and executing the crime. The couple's journey took them through multiple states, but they were running out of places to hide. Modern law enforcement technology made it increasingly difficult for fugitives to remain undetected for long periods, especially when they were wanted in connection with such a high-profile case. The manhunt came to an end in Catoosa, Oklahoma. At a Walmart parking lot, flock camera systems, which had been tracking the couple's vehicle, picked them up as they arrived at the store. Newly released body cam footage from Catoosa police would later show the couple's final moments, walking into the store together, unaware that their time as fugitives was about to end. When law enforcement moved in to apprehend them, the confrontation ended in violence. Both Nathaniel Huey Jr. and Ermelinda Palomo died in the encounter with police. The exact details of how the confrontation unfolded would be the subject of investigation by Oklahoma authorities, but the end result was that both suspects in the Romeoville murders were dead. For the families of the victims, this ending was bittersweet. There would be no trial, no opportunity to hear the full story of why their loved ones had died, and no chance for the kind of justice that comes from seeing perpetrators held accountable in a court of law. The deaths of Huey and Palomo in Oklahoma brought the case to a close, but they also left many questions unanswered. During the months following the deaths of the suspects, investigators continued to piece together the full story of what had happened. Phone records, digital evidence, and witness interviews gradually revealed the true scope of Ermelinda Palomo's role in the murders. What emerged was a picture of sophisticated psychological manipulation. Palomo hadn't simply encouraged Huey to commit violence. She had crafted an elaborate false reality designed to make him believe that murder was his only option. Her use of fabricated threats from imaginary drug runners showed a level of premeditation and calculation that was truly chilling. The investigation revealed that Palomo had spent considerable time researching and planning the murders. She wasn't acting in the heat of passion or out of jealousy alone. She was methodically working to eliminate what she saw as a threat to her relationship with Huey. In her mind, the deaths of Zoraida, Alberto and their children were acceptable collateral damage in her war to maintain control over her fiancé. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery that Palomo had convinced Huey that killing the children was an act of mercy. She had manipulated him into believing that Adriel and Diego would be better off dead than alive without parents, a rationalization that allowed him to commit acts of violence against innocent children while believing he was protecting them. As the investigation concluded and the details of the crime became public, it was important not to lose sight of the real victims in this case. Alberto Roland and Zoraida Bartolome were more than just names in a police report. They were individuals with hopes, dreams, and plans for the future that were cruelly cut short. Alberto was remembered as a dedicated father who worked hard to provide for his family. He had been proud of their new home and excited about the opportunities it represented for his children. Those who knew him described him as a man who put his family first, and who was always willing to help others in need. Zoraida, despite the affair that had ultimately led to tragedy, was remembered as a loving mother who adored her children. Her social media posts from the months before her death showed a woman who was genuinely happy about her family's new beginning. She had been looking forward to making memories in their new home, creating traditions and watching her boys grow up. 9-year-old Adriel had been an excellent student who loved to read and was curious about everything around him. His teachers remembered him as a bright child with a quick smile and a willingness to help his classmates. He had been excited about the new school year and had made friends quickly in their new neighborhood. 7-year-old Diego was remembered for his infectious laughter and his ability to find joy in simple things. He loved playing with the family's dogs and had been learning to ride a bike in their new driveway. His innocence and happiness had made him a favorite among family members and family friends. Even the family's 3 dogs were mourned by those who knew them. They had been beloved pets who were part of the family's daily routine and brought comfort and companionship to the household. The conclusion of the Romeoville murders case left many in the community struggling with difficult questions. How could such violence occur in their quiet neighborhood? What signs might have been missed that could have prevented the tragedy? And how could a young woman like Ermelinda Palomo orchestrate such a calculated and cruel crime? The case highlighted the dangers of domestic violence and psychological manipulation. Experts who reviewed the case noted that Palomo's methods were consistent with patterns seen in other cases involving manipulation and coercive control. Her ability to convince Huey that murder was necessary for their safety demonstrated the power that skilled manipulators can wield over their victims. The investigation also raised questions about the role of criminal history in predicting future violence. Huey's lengthy record and history of illegal firearm possession were red flags that might have been addressed more aggressively by the criminal justice system. Whether more intensive supervision or intervention might have prevented the tragedy remains a subject of debate among criminal justice professionals. For the Hampton Park subdivision and the broader Romeoville community, the murders served as a stark reminder that violence can strike anywhere, often without warning. The fact that such horror could unfold in their quiet neighborhood challenged residents' sense of safety and security. The Romeoville murders case serves as a tragic reminder of several important truths about human nature and criminal behavior. First, it demonstrates how psychological manipulation can be used as a weapon, turning one person into an instrument of violence against innocent victims. Palomo's ability to convince Huey that murder was necessary shows how dangerous skilled manipulators can be, especially when they target individuals who are already vulnerable due to criminal history or psychological instability. The case also highlights the importance of recognizing warning signs in relationships. While the full extent of Palomo's manipulation wasn't apparent to those around her, there may have been signs that, if recognized and reported, could have led to intervention before violence occurred. Domestic violence experts often emphasize that controlling and manipulative behavior typically escalates over time, and early intervention can be crucial in preventing tragic outcomes. The systematic nature of the crime, including the killing of the family's pets, also provides insights into the psychology of mass murder. The calculation and planning involved in the case distinguish it from crimes of passion and highlight the particular dangers posed by individuals who are capable of methodical violence. For law enforcement, the case demonstrated both the challenges and the capabilities of modern investigation techniques. The ability to track the suspects through various technological means ultimately led to their identification and location, but it couldn't bring back the victims or provide complete answers to all the questions raised by the case. In the months following the murders, the Romeoville community worked to heal and to honor the memory of the victims. Memorials were established for the family, and community members came together to support one another through the grief and trauma caused by the tragedy. The case also sparked discussions about community safety and the importance of looking out for one another. While no community can completely protect itself from all forms of violence, the tragedy reminded residents of the value of staying connected with their neighbors and being aware of potential warning signs. Schools in the area provided counseling and support for children who were struggling to understand how such violence could occur in their community. The deaths of Adriel and Diego were particularly difficult for young people to process, as they forced children to confront the reality that violence can affect families just like their own. Local law enforcement agencies also used the case as an opportunity to review their procedures and to strengthen their ability to respond to domestic violence situations. While the murders occurred without warning to the community, the investigation that followed demonstrated the importance of thorough police work and interagency cooperation. The deaths of Nathaniel Huey Jr. and Ermelinda Palomo in Oklahoma meant that traditional justice through the court system was not possible in this case. There would be no trial where evidence could be presented, no opportunity for victim impact statements, and no formal sentencing that might provide some sense of closure for the survivors. This outcome left many people with mixed feelings. While the deaths of the perpetrators meant that they could never harm anyone else, it also meant that many questions about their motivations and planning would never be fully answered. The families of the victims were denied the opportunity to see justice served in a courtroom, and the community was denied the sense of resolution that often comes from a successful prosecution. However, the thorough investigation conducted by Romeoville police and other agencies did provide important answers about what had happened and why. The release of investigation files allowed the public to understand the scope of the manipulation and planning involved in the crime, even if the perpetrators were no longer alive to be held accountable. The case serves as a reminder that justice doesn't always come in the form we expect or want. Sometimes the best we can hope for is understanding, remembrance, and the prevention of similar tragedies in the future. The story of the Romeoville murders is ultimately a story about the fragility of life and the unpredictable nature of human evil. Alberto Rolon, Zoraida Bartolome, and their children Adriel and Diego were living ordinary lives, pursuing ordinary dreams when they became victims of an extraordinary act of violence, orchestrated by someone they barely knew. Their story reminds us that behind every crime statistic are real people with real lives, families who love them, and communities that mourn their loss. The randomness of their fate being targeted not because of anything they had done, but because of someone else's jealousy and manipulation, speaks to the fundamental unfairness that sometimes characterizes human existence. Yet their story also demonstrates the resilience of communities in the face of tragedy, the dedication of law enforcement officers who work tirelessly to find answers, and the importance of remembering victims as more than just casualties of crime. They were individuals with their own hopes, dreams, fears, and joys, people whose lives mattered and whose memories deserve to be preserved. As we conclude this examination of the Romeoville murders, we remember Alberto, Zoraida, Adriel, and Diego not as victims of violence, but as people who lived, loved, and were loved in return. Their story is tragic, but their lives had meaning beyond their deaths, and their memory serves as a reminder to cherish the ordinary moments that make up our days. For we never know when they might be taken from us. In the quiet suburb of Romeoville, Illinois, life has gradually returned to something resembling normal. Children play in the Hampton Park subdivision. Families continue to pursue their dreams of homeownership and security, and the community has worked to heal from the trauma of September 2023. But the memory of what happened on Concord Avenue serves as a permanent reminder of both human frailty and human resilience. A story that will be remembered long after the headlines fade and the news cameras move on to other tragedies. The Romeoville murders case officially closed with the deaths of the perpetrators in Oklahoma. But the questions it raised about manipulation, domestic violence, community safety, and the nature of evil continue to resonate. It stands as a stark reminder that in our interconnected world, the actions of a few individuals can shatter the lives of many. That the price of such violence extends far beyond its immediate victims, to encompass entire communities and all those who struggle to understand how such things can happen in the places we call home. This has been the story of the Romeoville family murders, a case that shocked a community, challenged investigators, and ultimately revealed the devastating consequences of manipulation, jealousy, and unchecked violence. May the victims rest in peace, and may their story serve as both a warning and a reminder of the preciousness of the ordinary lives we sometimes take for granted. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. In the quiet suburban streets of Berea, Ohio, where tree-lined neighborhoods stretched peacefully across the landscape, the spring of 1986 seemed like any other. Children walked home from school along familiar sidewalks. Parents tended to their gardens, and life moved at the gentle pace of small-town America. But sometimes, darkness can hide behind the most ordinary facades, and tragedy can strike in the most unexpected places. This is the story of 13-year-old Robin Starfield, a bright, spirited girl whose life was cut tragically short on a spring evening that would forever change her family and community. It's a story of betrayal, of a friendship that turned deadly, and of a family's decades-long fight for justice. Robin Starfield was the kind of child who brought light into every room she entered. Her family described her as sparkly, an upbeat, happy girl who approached life with an infectious enthusiasm. At 13, she was navigating those complex teenage years with the natural curiosity and trust that comes with youth. She lived in a modest home in Berea, a community where neighbors knew each other and children could walk to school without fear. Robin attended the local middle school, where she had made friends and was building the relationships that seemed so important during those formative years. Among her classmates was a 15-year-old boy named Warren Paxton Brown. To most who knew him, Warren appeared to be just another teenager, but beneath the surface, something far more sinister was brewing. Warren Paxton Brown had developed feelings for Robin, in the way that teenage crushes can sometimes consume young minds. Warren's interest in Robin had grown beyond normal affection into something more intense, more possessive. He wanted to date her, but Robin didn't share his romantic feelings. For most teenagers, this would have been a disappointing but normal part of growing up. The reality that not every crush is reciprocated. But Warren wasn't most teenagers. When Robin politely declined his romantic advances, something dark began to take shape in his mind. Rather than accepting her decision with the grace that healthy relationships require, Warren began to harbor resentment. That resentment would slowly transform into something far more dangerous. In the weeks leading up to that fateful April evening, Warren began to confide in friends about his growing anger toward Robin. These weren't just the typical complaints of a rejected teenager. Warren spoke to his friends about something far more chilling. He began to reveal a plan to get back at Robin for refusing him. A plan that would ultimately cost a young girl her life. On the evening of April 22nd, 1986, Robin was going about her normal routine. School had ended. Like so many teenagers, she was spending time with friends in her neighborhood. The spring air was mild, and the streets of Berea felt as safe as they always had. When Warren approached Robin that evening, she had no reason to fear him. He was a classmate, someone she knew from school. Perhaps she even considered him a friend. Warren had carefully crafted his approach. He told Robin he wanted to show her something at his house, which was less than a block away from her own home. The proximity to her house, the familiar neighborhood setting, and Warren's status as a classmate all served to lower any guard she might have had. In that innocent moment, Robin made a decision that would cost her everything. She agreed to go with him. The walk to Warren's house was short, just a few minutes through the neighborhood where Robin had grown up. She had no way of knowing that Warren had been planning this moment, that his invitation wasn't born of friendship, but of a twisted desire for control and revenge. As they approached his house, Robin was simply a 13-year-old girl who trusted a classmate. What happened next in Warren's bedroom would haunt investigators and Robin's family for decades to come. Warren didn't simply want to show Robin something. He had lured her there with far more sinister intentions. Once inside his bedroom, Warren attempted to rape the young girl. Robin fought back. The evidence would later show that she struggled valiantly against her attacker. But she was no match for Warren's size and violent determination. When his assault didn't go as planned, when Robin's resistance frustrated his twisted desires, Warren's violence escalated beyond even his original horrific intentions. In his rage and desperation to control the situation, Warren began to beat Robin. The coroner would later determine that her head had been slammed repeatedly, causing severe bruising and trauma. But even this wasn't enough to satisfy Warren's need for complete dominance. As Robin lay injured and terrified, Warren made the decision to end her life entirely. Warren wrapped his hands around Robin's throat and began to squeeze. The medical examiner would later conclude that Robin died by manual strangulation. Warren literally squeezed the life out of her with his bare hands. For several agonizing minutes, as Robin fought for air, Warren maintained his grip until her struggles finally ceased. But Warren's evil didn't end with Robin's death. Now faced with the reality of what he had done, he needed to hide the evidence of his crime. With Robin's lifeless body in his bedroom, Warren began the cold, calculated process of concealing his crime. He wrapped her body in a bedsheet, a piece of fabric that would later become crucial evidence in the case against him. The sheet would carry traces of fibers, DNA, and other forensic evidence that investigators would use to build their case. Warren then carried Robin's body from his bedroom out into the night. His destination was the Mill Stream Reservation in nearby Strongsville, a wooded area where he hoped her remains might not be discovered for some time, if ever. The reservation was a natural area with hiking trails and a small stream running through it, the kind of place where families might go for weekend picnics or nature walks. Under the cover of darkness, Warren dumped Robin's body along the banks of the stream. He positioned her among the trees and underbrush, wrapped in the bedsheet that he hoped would protect her remains from the elements and perhaps delay identification. Then, with the horrific deed complete, Warren returned to his normal teenage life as if nothing had happened. The next morning, April 23, 1986, dawned bright and clear. Local fishermen had decided to try their luck at the mill stream, drawn by the peaceful setting and the promise of a relaxing day by the water. As they made their way along the stream bank, carrying their fishing gear and perhaps sharing quiet conversation, they spotted something that would shatter the morning's tranquility. There, wrapped in a bedsheet and partially concealed by the natural vegetation along the stream, was the body of a young girl. The fishermen immediately recognized that they had stumbled upon a crime scene, and they quickly contacted local authorities. Meanwhile, back in Berea, Robin's family was growing increasingly worried. She hadn't come home the previous evening, which was completely unlike their responsible daughter. They had reported her missing to police, hoping that she had simply lost track of time or stayed overnight with a friend without calling. But as the morning progressed without word from Robin, their concern deepened into genuine fear. When police arrived at the Mill Stream Reservation, they began the careful process of securing the crime scene and examining the evidence. The body was clearly that of a young girl, and the bedsheet wrapping suggested this was no accident. This was murder, and it had happened recently. The Berea Police Department, working with the Cuyahoga County Sheriff's Office, launched an immediate investigation into Robin's murder. The crime scene at Mill Stream provided several crucial pieces of evidence. The bedsheet that Warren had used to wrap Robin's body would prove to be a goldmine for forensic investigators. Fiber analysis, microscopic examination, and other forensic techniques available in 1986 would all be brought to bear on this critical piece of evidence. The coroner's autopsy provided the grim details of how Robin had died. The manual strangulation was evident from the injuries to her throat and neck. The blunt force trauma to her head told the story of a violent struggle. Evidence of sexual assault confirmed investigators' suspicions that this crime had multiple motivations. Detectives began the methodical process of interviewing Robin's friends, family members, and classmates. They wanted to know about her activities in the days and weeks leading up to her death, who she had been spending time with, and whether she had mentioned feeling threatened or uncomfortable around anyone. It was during these interviews that Warren Paxton Brown's name began to surface. Multiple classmates mentioned that Warren had expressed romantic interest in Robin. Some recalled conversations where Warren had seemed upset or frustrated about Robin's lack of reciprocation. A few even remembered Warren making disturbing comments about Robin in the days before her death. As investigators dug deeper into Warren's background and activities, they discovered the most chilling evidence of all. Warren hadn't kept his murderous intentions entirely to himself. In the days and weeks before killing Robin, he had actually revealed his plan to friends. These weren't vague threats or teenage posturing. Warren had specifically told people that he intended to kill Robin Field. The revelation that Warren had premeditated the murder changed the entire complexion of the case. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. Warren had deliberately planned to lure Robin to his house with the intention of harming her. The fact that he had shared this plan with others demonstrated a level of calculation that was both shocking and legally significant. Investigators also focused on the physical evidence linking Warren to the crime. The bed sheet used to wrap Robin's body was analyzed for fibers that could be matched to Warren's home environment. Hair and fiber evidence collected from the crime scene were compared to samples from Warren and his residence. The proximity of Warren's house to Robin's, combined with his known interest in her and the witness statements about his threats, created a compelling circumstantial case that investigators wanted to be thorough. They continued building their evidence methodically, knowing that the case against a 15-year-old defendant would be scrutinized carefully by the courts. When police finally had enough evidence to make an arrest, they confronted Warren with the accumulated proof of his crime. Unlike many defendants who maintained their innocence, Warren eventually acknowledged his role in Robin's death. The weight of the evidence, combined perhaps with the psychological burden of carrying such a secret, led Warren to confess to the murder. His confession provided investigators with details that only the killer could have known. Warren described how he had lured Robin to his house, how he had attempted to assault her, and how he had ultimately killed her when she resisted. He admitted to wrapping her body in the bedsheet and dumping it at Millstream Reservation. The confession, combined with the physical evidence and witness testimony, created an airtight case against Warren Paxton Brown. At 15 years old, he was charged with aggravated murder in the death of 13-year-old Robin Starfield. The trial of Warren Paxton Brown drew significant attention throughout Ohio. Cases involving juvenile defendants charged with murder are relatively rare, and the calculated nature of Warren's crime made it particularly shocking to the community. The prosecution presented a methodical case, walking the jury through the evidence step by step. The physical evidence was compelling. The bedsheet fibers, the crime scene analysis, and the forensic evidence all pointed to Warren as the killer. The witness testimony about Warren's premeditation was equally damning. Here was a defendant who hadn't just killed in a moment of rage, but who had planned the murder and shared his intentions with others. Warren's defense team faced an almost impossible task. Their client had confessed to the crime, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The best they could hope for was to argue for mitigation based on Warren's age, and perhaps his psychological state, but the prosecution painted a picture of a calculating killer who had shown no mercy to his young victim. They emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, the sexual assault, and the callous way Warren had disposed of Robin's body. The attempted rape, followed by the brutal beating and strangulation, showed a level of depravity that shocked even experienced prosecutors. Judge James Kilbane, who presided over the case, was clearly moved by the evidence of Warren's crimes. During sentencing, he described Warren as a cold, calculating, violent murderer who was completely devoid of truth, moral integrity, or love. These weren't words the judge used lightly. They reflected his assessment of the evidence and Warren's character. Warren was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. The sentence meant that he would serve a minimum of 20 years before becoming eligible for parole, but it also meant that he could potentially spend the rest of his life behind bars if the parole board determined he remained a danger to society. For Robin's family, the conviction and sentencing of Warren Paxton Brown brought a measure of justice, but it could never bring back their beloved daughter and sister. Robin's mother and her half-brother Rick Schultz faced the difficult task of rebuilding their lives after such a devastating loss. In the years following the trial, they would learn additional details about the crime that made their grief even more difficult to bear. Initially, they had been told that Robin's ordeal had lasted about 5 minutes, but later they discovered that she had been alive and suffering for much longer during the attack. These revelations added new layers of pain to an already unimaginable loss. Warren, meanwhile, began serving his sentence in the Ohio prison system. As a juvenile offender, he was eventually transferred to adult facilities as he matured. Over the years, he would be housed in various institutions throughout Ohio, including the Southeastern Correctional Complex in Lancaster. The passage of time did not diminish the horror of Warren's crimes or the pain felt by Robin's family. If anything, the years that followed would prove that Warren's capacity for causing pain extended far beyond that terrible night in 1986. As Warren's 20th year of incarceration approached, Robin's family faced a new nightmare, the possibility that her killer might be released from prison. The parole system in Ohio, like in many states, is designed to give offenders a chance to demonstrate that they have been rehabilitated and can safely return to society. For someone serving a sentence of 20 years to life, the first parole hearing typically occurs after the minimum 20-year term has been served. For Robin's family, the thought of Warren walking free was unbearable. They had lived with the comfort of knowing that their daughter's killer was behind bars, unable to hurt anyone else. The possibility of his release forced them to relive the trauma of the original crime and to fight for justice all over again. Preparing for parole hearings requires families to present victim impact statements, to advocate for keeping dangerous offenders incarcerated, and to relive the details of their loved one's death. For Robin's mother and Rick Schultz, this meant opening old wounds and facing the possibility that their advocacy might not be enough to keep Warren in prison. The parole board's decision would depend on multiple factors: Warren's behavior while incarcerated, his participation in rehabilitation programs, his acceptance of responsibility for his crimes, and the ongoing threat he might pose to public safety. But equally important would be the voices of Robin's family and the broader community who could speak to the lasting impact of Warren's crimes. Fortunately for public safety and for Robin's family, the Ohio Parole Board has consistently recognized that Warren Paxton Brown remains too dangerous to release. In 2015, a panel denied parole for Warren, then 44 years old, for an additional 5 years. This decision brought relief to Robin's family, but they knew it was only temporary. In 2019, the parole board again denied Warren's request for release, and similar denials followed in subsequent hearings. Each denial meant that Robin's family could rest easier for a few more years. But it also meant they would have to repeat the process again when Warren became eligible for his next hearing. The consistency of these denials suggests that the parole board recognizes something that Robin's family has known all along. Warren Paxton Brown committed a crime so heinous, so calculated, and so brutal that he poses a continuing threat to society. The premeditated nature of the murder, combined with Warren's lack of genuine remorse and rehabilitation, has convinced multiple parole boards that he should remain incarcerated. 33 years after Robin's murder, her family continues to fight to keep Warren behind bars. Rick Schultz, Robin's half-brother, has become a tireless advocate for victims' rights and for keeping dangerous offenders incarcerated. He attends parole hearings, organizes community support, and works to ensure that Robin's story is not forgotten. The family has created websites, organized petition drives, and reached out to the media to tell Robin's story and to advocate against Warren's release. They have described Warren as a monster who should not be rewarded with freedom, reflecting their belief that some crimes are so heinous that life imprisonment should truly mean life. Their efforts have garnered significant community support. People who remember the original crime, parents who fear for their own children's safety, and advocates for victims' rights have all rallied behind the family's cause. Petition drives have collected thousands of signatures from people who believe Warren should never be released. Perhaps most chilling of all is Warren's own perspective on his crimes and imprisonment. Unlike many inmates, Warren has not proclaimed his innocence. He has acknowledged his guilt in the murder of Robin Starfield, which might seem like a positive step toward rehabilitation. However, Warren's acknowledgement of guilt has not translated into the kind of genuine remorse and rehabilitation that would make him suitable for release. His petition for parole reveals a man who sees his incarceration primarily in terms of what it has cost him, rather than what his actions cost Robin and her family. The fact that Warren continues to seek parole, despite the overwhelming evidence that he remains dangerous, suggests a level of narcissism and lack of empathy that characterized his original crime. A truly rehabilitated person might recognize that some crimes warrant life imprisonment, and that the safety of potential victims outweighs their desire for freedom. The murder of Robin Starfield has had impacts that extend far beyond her immediate family. The case has become a symbol of the need for strong victim advocacy and careful oversight of parole decisions. It has highlighted the importance of taking juvenile threats seriously and recognizing that some young offenders can be just as dangerous as adult criminals. The case has also contributed to ongoing debates about juvenile justice, life sentences, and parole. While most people believe in the possibility of rehabilitation, Robin's case demonstrates that some crimes are so calculated and brutal that they reveal something fundamentally wrong with the perpetrator's character. something that may not be fixable through traditional rehabilitation programs. For parents and educators, Robin's story serves as a tragic reminder of the importance of teaching children about personal safety, recognizing warning signs of dangerous behavior in others, and creating environments where young people can report threats without fear. The fact that Warren had shared his murderous intentions with other teenagers suggests that there might have been opportunities to prevent the crime if those warnings had been taken more seriously. Through all the years of legal battles, parole hearings, and advocacy efforts, Robin's family has worked to ensure that their daughter and sister is remembered not just as a victim, but as the vibrant, loving person she was. They have shared memories of her sparkling personality, her love of life, and her bright future that was cut so tragically short. Robin would be in her 50s now if she had lived. She might have married, had children of her own, pursued a career, and touched countless other lives with the same joy and enthusiasm that she brought to her 13 years. The ripple effects of her loss, the grandchildren never born, the friendships never formed, the contributions never made, represent an incalculable loss to the world. But Robin's legacy also includes the impact her story has had on victims' rights advocacy, public safety awareness, and the ongoing fight for justice. Her family's determination to keep her memory alive and to protect others from similar crimes has turned their personal tragedy into a force for positive change. As of recent reports, Warren Paxton Brown continues to seek parole and remains incarcerated. He has now served over 37 years for Robin's murder, far longer than his minimum sentence of 20 years. Yet the parole board continues to deny his request for release, recognizing that the passage of time alone does not erase the magnitude of his crimes or eliminate the threat he poses. Robin's family continues their vigilant advocacy, attending hearings, organizing support, and telling Robin's story to anyone who will listen. They understand that their fight may continue for the rest of their lives, but they also understand that this fight is essential to honor Robin's memory and to protect other potential victims. Each parole hearing brings new stress and trauma for the family, forcing them to relive the worst moments of their lives and to argue for what they see as basic justice. But they persist because they know that Robin cannot speak for herself, and they will not let her voice be silenced by time or bureaucracy. The murder of Robin Starfield offers several important lessons for society. First, it demonstrates that age alone should not be a shield for violent criminals. While 15-year-old Warren was certainly young when he committed his crime, the calculated, premeditated nature of his actions revealed a level of evil that transcended his youth. Second, the case highlights the importance of taking threats seriously, especially when they involve violence against women and girls. Warren had shared his murderous intentions with friends before acting on them. In a different environment, with different responses to his threats, Robin might still be alive today. Third, Robin's story underscores the lasting impact of violent crime on families and communities. Nearly 4 decades after her death, her family continues to fight for justice and to cope with their loss. The trauma of violent crime doesn't fade with time. It evolves and takes new forms, but it never truly disappears. Finally, the case demonstrates the importance of victim advocacy in the justice system. Without the persistent efforts of Robin's family, Warren might have been released years ago to potentially harm other innocent people. Their advocacy has not only honored Robin's memory, but has also contributed to public safety. As we reflect on Robin's story, we are reminded that justice is not a single event, but an ongoing process. The conviction and sentencing of Warren Paxton Brown was just the beginning of a journey that continues today. Each parole hearing, each advocacy effort, each time someone shares Robin's story, represents another step in the long march toward justice. The family's vigilance serves as a powerful reminder that the victims of violent crime are not just statistics or case files. They are real people whose lives had value, whose deaths created irreparable losses, and whose memories deserve to be honored and protected. Robin Starfield was a 13-year-old girl with dreams, hopes, and a bright future ahead of her. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. When Warren Paxton Brown made the decision to end her life, he didn't just kill one person. He shattered a family, traumatized a community, and deprived the world of all the contributions Robin might have made. The reverberations of his crime continue to this day, affecting not just Robin's immediate family, but everyone who has been touched by her story. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this tragic story is the strength and determination shown by Robin's family in the decades since her death. Instead of being consumed by bitterness or retreating from the world, they have channeled their grief into action. They have become advocates, educators, and guardians of their daughter's memory. Their efforts have undoubtedly prevented Warren's release and may have prevented him from harming other innocent people. In this way, they have transformed their personal tragedy into a force for protecting others. Something that Robin herself, with her caring and generous spirit, would undoubtedly support. The family's advocacy has also contributed to broader conversations about victims' rights, parole reform, and public safety. Their willingness to share their story, despite the pain it causes them, has educated countless people about the realities of violent crime and the ongoing needs of victims' families. As this story draws to a close, it's important to remember that for Robin's family, there is no real ending. Their loss continues every day, and their fight for justice continues with each parole hearing. The story of Robin Starfield is not just a true crime case from the 1980s. It is an ongoing testament to the enduring power of love, the persistence of evil, and the never-ending struggle for justice. Robin Starfield was 13 years old when her life was cut short by someone she trusted, someone she considered a friend. She died far too young, in circumstances too horrific to fully comprehend. But her memory lives on in the hearts of those who loved her, in the advocacy efforts of her family, and in the story that continues to be told nearly 4 decades later. Her killer remains behind bars, where he belongs, thanks largely to the tireless efforts of a family who refuses to let their daughter be forgotten or her killer be rewarded with freedom. And as long as they have strength to fight, Warren Paxton Brown will face the consequences of his actions every time he seeks release from the prison that has been his home for more than 37 years. In the quiet suburbs of Berea, Ohio, where this story began, life has moved on. Children still walk to school on tree-lined streets, families still tend their gardens, and the rhythm of small-town life continues. But in the hearts of those who remember Robin Starfield, her light continues to shine. A reminder of a life cut short but never forgotten, and a call to vigilance that justice must be more than a single moment in time. It must be an ongoing commitment to protecting the innocent and holding the guilty accountable for their crimes. Robin's story reminds us that every life has value, that every victim deserves to be remembered, and that the fight for justice never truly ends. It is a story of tragedy and loss, but also of love, determination, and the unbreakable bonds between family members who refuse to let darkness have the final word. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we journey to the quiet plains of South Dakota, to a story that began with love, transformed into betrayal, and ended in tragedy. This is the story of Tommy Ray, a woman whose life was cut short by the very person who had promised to protect her. So as we settle in, let me tell you this tale of love turned deadly. In the early 2000s, Pierre, South Dakota was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody. The state capital, with its population of just over 13,000 people, was a tight-knit community where news traveled fast and secrets were hard to keep. It was here that Tommy Burns Ray had built what seemed to be an ordinary life. Tommy was 41 years old in 2006, a woman who had found her rhythm in the simple pleasures of small-town existence. She worked at the local Kmart, a job that brought her into contact with neighbors and friends on a daily basis. Her coworkers knew her as reliable, friendly, and dedicated, the kind of person who showed up early and never complained about staying late when needed. At home, Tommy was a devoted mother to her young daughter, Haley, who was just 12 years old at the time. The little girl was the light of Tommy's life, and anyone who knew them could see the deep bond between mother and daughter. They lived in a modest home with Tommy's husband, Brad Ray, a man who to the outside world seemed like a loving husband and stepfather. Brad Ray was Tommy's second chance at love. Like many couples in their 40s, both had come to their relationship carrying the experiences and sometimes the scars of previous relationships. Brad had seemed like a stable, caring partner when they married, and for a time their life together appeared to be everything Tommy had hoped for. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary family, tensions were beginning to build. Marriage, even the best ones, require constant work and communication. And somewhere along the way, Brad and Tommy had begun to drift apart. The exact timeline of when their relationship began to deteriorate remains unclear, but what we do know is that by early 2006, their marriage was in serious trouble. Tommy, like many women who find themselves in unhappy marriages, began to question whether she deserved more from life. She was still young, still vibrant, and still capable of finding happiness. It was during this vulnerable time in her marriage that she met someone who would change the trajectory of her life forever. At work, Tommy had developed a friendship with a coworker named Brian Clark. Brian was also married, also struggling with his own relationship issues. And in the way that these things sometimes happen, their friendship gradually deepened into something more. They found in each other a kind of understanding and connection that had been missing from their respective marriages. The affair, for that's what it had become, provided Tommy with something she had been craving: attention, affection, and the feeling that someone truly valued her. For a woman who had been feeling invisible in her own home, Brian's interest was intoxicating. They would spend time together after work, talking about their dreams, their disappointments, and their hopes for the future. Brian became more than just a lover to Tommy. He became a confidant and a source of emotional support. In the claustrophobic environment of a small town where affairs are difficult to hide and gossip spreads like wildfire, Tommy and Brian tried to be discreet, but secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially when they involve matters of the heart. Whether Brad suspected the affair or had concrete knowledge of it is something that would later become crucial to understanding the events that followed. What we do know is that Brad Ree was not the kind of man who took betrayal lightly. Those who knew him described him as possessive and controlling, traits that had perhaps been present in his relationship with Tommy all along, but had become more pronounced as their marriage deteriorated. The winter of 2006 was particularly harsh in South Dakota, with bitter cold and heavy snow that seemed to mirror the growing chill in the Riaway household. February arrived with its usual brutality, bringing with it temperatures that could freeze a person solid in minutes, and winds that cut through even the heaviest coats. It was during this bleak month that the storm brewing in the Riaway marriage would finally break. Tuesday, February 7th, 2006 began like any other day for Tommy Ray. She woke up in her modest home in Pierre, prepared breakfast for her family, and got her daughter ready for school. The morning routine was familiar and comforting, a series of small rituals that anchored her day before heading off to work at Kmart. At work, Tommy went through her usual tasks, interacting with customers and co-workers with her characteristic warmth and professionalism. Brian Clark was also working that day, and though they had to be careful about their interactions in front of others, the connection between them was still there, still providing Tommy with the emotional sustenance she craved. That evening, Tommy returned home to find Brad in what seemed to be a normal mood. Haley was there, doing homework or watching television, just being a typical 12-year-old. The family went through their evening routine. Dinner, perhaps some television, the usual preparations for the next day. To anyone looking in from the outside, it would have appeared to be an ordinary Tuesday night in the Ray household. But something was different that night. Something had changed in Brad Ria's mind. Though exactly what triggered his final decision remains known only to him. Perhaps he had discovered definitive proof of Tommy's affair. Perhaps his suspicions had finally crystallized into certainty. Or perhaps the accumulated resentments and jealousies of a failing marriage had simply reached a breaking point. As the family prepared for bed that night, none of them could have known that they were living through the last normal hours of their lives together. Haley went to her room, probably thinking about school the next day, about friends, about all the small concerns that fill a child's mind. Tommy and Brad retired to their bedroom, where the facade of married normalcy would soon come to a violent end. What happened next was reconstructed later by investigators. Forensic experts and prosecutors pieced together from physical evidence, autopsy results, and Brad's own contradictory statements. It was a story of rage, betrayal, and violence that would shock even experienced law enforcement officers. According to the evidence that would later be presented in court, Brad Ree attacked his wife while she was sleeping, defenseless and vulnerable in their shared bed. The attack was swift, brutal, and overwhelmingly violent. Brad stabbed Tammy 5 times in the back as she lay sleeping, then slashed her throat in a wound so deep it was nearly fatal on its own. But Brad's rage wasn't satisfied with those initial wounds. The prosecution would later theorize that after the initial attack, he wrapped Tommy's bleeding body in blankets and moved her to his car, perhaps believing she was already dead. But Tommy was still alive, still fighting for her life. And what happened next suggests that Brad's fury had not yet been spent. At some point after moving her body, Brad stabbed Tommy multiple times more, bringing the total number of stab wounds to more than 36. The pathologist who later examined her body would describe the attack as going overboard, driven by a rage so intense it was difficult for even experienced investigators to comprehend. The level of violence was extraordinary, even by the standards of domestic homicides, which are notoriously brutal. This wasn't a crime of passion that ended quickly. It was a sustained, methodical assault that spoke to a depth of anger and resentment that had been building for some time. After Tommy was finally dead, Brad faced the challenge that confronts all murderers. What to do with the body? He was in his home with his stepdaughter sleeping just rooms away, and the evidence of his crime was overwhelming. Blood had stained the bedding, the floors, and his clothing. The smell of death was beginning to permeate the house. Brad made the decision to dispose of Tammy's body somewhere far from the house, somewhere she wouldn't be found quickly, if at all. He loaded her naked body into his vehicle and drove through the bitter February night to an isolated area north of Pierre, near the emergency spillway at Ouajam. The location he chose was remote and desolate, the kind of place where a body might remain undiscovered for months or even years. He dumped Tommy's body in the frozen landscape, along with a knife-riddled t-shirt and bloody gloves, then drove back home to begin what he hoped would be a convincing performance as a worried husband. Wednesday morning, February 8, 2006. Dawn cold and gray in Pierre, South Dakota. At the local Kmart, Brian Clark was expecting to see Tommy arrive for her shift. But as the morning progressed and she failed to appear, his concern grew. Tommy was not the type of person to miss work without calling, and she certainly wasn't someone who would simply abandon her responsibilities. Brian's worry went beyond that, of a typical coworker. As Tommy's lover, he knew details about her life that others didn't. Knew her routines and her concerns. When she didn't show up and couldn't be reached, Brian made the decision to contact the police to report her missing. At the Rie household, Brad was putting on a show of confusion and concern. When contacted by law enforcement about his missing wife, he expressed surprise and worry, claiming he had no idea where Tommy might be. He told officers that she had been home the night before, that they had gone to bed together as usual, and that he had assumed she had left for work that morning while he was still sleeping. Brad's performance as the worried husband was convincing enough initially, but experienced investigators are trained to look beyond surface appearances. They began asking questions about the state of the Rie marriage, about any problems Tammy might have been having, about whether she had ever disappeared before. Meanwhile, a search for Tommy began. In a community as small as Pierre, the disappearance of a well-known resident quickly became the talk of the town. Volunteers joined law enforcement in searching likely locations, checking places where Tommy might have gone if she had left voluntarily, or where her body might be found if something terrible had happened to her. The search was complicated by the harsh winter weather. February in South Dakota is unforgiving, with temperatures that can kill exposed humans in minutes, and snow that can hide evidence or bodies until spring. But the searchers persisted, driven by the hope that Tommy might still be alive somewhere, waiting for rescue. As the search continued, investigators were also working to piece together Tammy's last known movements. They spoke with her co-workers at Kmart, with neighbors and with friends, trying to develop a timeline of her activities in the days leading up to her disappearance. It was during these interviews that investigators learned about the affair between Tommy and Brian Clark. This information added a new dimension to the case, introducing the possibility of jealousy and betrayal as motives for Tommy's disappearance. On Friday, February 10th, 2006, 3 days after Tommy was first reported missing, the search took a grim turn. A South Dakota National Guard helicopter, conducting an aerial search of the remote areas around Pierre, spotted something unusual near the emergency spillway at Ouajam. From the air, the pilot could make out what appeared to be a human form lying in the snow in an isolated area north of the city. The helicopter circled lower, confirming the worst fears of everyone involved in the search. They had found a body. Ground crews rushed to the location, navigating the difficult terrain in the bitter cold. What they discovered there would haunt the investigators for years to come. Tammy Ramsey's naked body lay frozen in the snow, her throat slashed and her body bearing the wounds of more than 36 stab wounds. The scene was horrific beyond description. The violence that had been inflicted on Tommy was immediately apparent, even to the first responders who had seen their share of traumatic scenes. Near her body, investigators found a knife-riddled t-shirt and bloody gloves, evidence that would later prove crucial to solving the case. The location where Tommy's body was found was significant for several reasons. It was remote enough that someone unfamiliar with the area would have had difficulty finding it, especially in the dark. This suggested that whoever had dumped her body there had local knowledge and had chosen the location deliberately. The condition of the body and the evidence at the scene also told a story. The multiple stab wounds, the slashed throat, and the obvious rage that had driven the attack all pointed to this being a crime of passion rather than a random act of violence. Dr. William Wilson, the pathologist who conducted Tammy's autopsy, would later describe the brutality of the attack in clinical terms that somehow made it even more chilling. The wounds were not just fatal, they were excessive, speaking to a killer who had been driven by an almost uncontrollable fury. News of the discovery spread quickly through Pierre and the surrounding communities. What had been a missing person case with the hope of a positive outcome had now become a murder investigation. And everyone who had known and loved Tommy was forced to confront the reality that she was never coming home.
With the discovery of Tommy's body, the Pierre Police Department, working in conjunction with the South Dakota Division of Criminal Investigation, launched a full homicide investigation. The case was assigned to experienced investigators who began the meticulous process of gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and developing suspects.
The first and most obvious suspect was Brad Ree himself. Statistical data shows that when a married woman is murdered, the husband is the perpetrator in a significant percentage of cases. Combined with the evidence of marital problems in Tommy's affair, Brad became the focus of intense scrutiny. Investigators began by thoroughly examining the Reddy household. They processed the crime scene, looking for blood evidence, signs of a struggle, and any physical evidence that might link Brad to his wife's murder. What they found during their initial search was suggestive, but not conclusive. There were signs that someone had attempted to clean up blood evidence in the master bedroom. Luminol testing revealed blood spatter patterns that indicated a violent attack had taken place there, despite obvious efforts to scrub away the evidence. Brad consented to several interviews with investigators, during which he maintained his innocence and expressed bewilderment about who might have wanted to harm his wife. He mentioned the affair, suggesting that perhaps Brian Clark or someone connected to him might have been responsible for Tommy's death. During these interviews, investigators noted several inconsistencies in Brad's story. His timeline of events the night Tammy disappeared kept changing in small but significant ways. His explanations for certain physical evidence became increasingly elaborate and unconvincing. Meanwhile, investigators were also looking closely at Brian Clark, the co-worker with whom Tommy had been having an affair. They interviewed him extensively, searching his home and vehicle and examining his activities during the time frame when Tommy was murdered. Brian was cooperative with the investigation, providing DNA samples and submitting to multiple interviews. He expressed genuine grief over Tommy's death and appeared to be forthcoming about the nature of their relationship. However, investigators couldn't rule him out entirely, given that he was the other man in what appeared to be a love triangle. As the investigation progressed, a bizarre twist emerged that would ultimately help solve the case while revealing the depths of Brad Ree's depravity. Several weeks after Tommy's murder, anonymous letters began arriving at the police station, allegedly from a cousin of Tommy's killer. These letters contained information about the murder that had not been released to the public, including disturbing details about sexual assault and evidence that had been planted inside Tommy's body. The letters suggested that the real killer was someone connected to Brian Clark, and they seemed designed to redirect the investigation away from Brad and toward Tommy's lover. The letters were obviously an attempt to manipulate the investigation, but they also revealed something that investigators had missed during the initial autopsy. Acting on information contained in the anonymous letters, Dr. Wilson conducted a second, more thorough examination of Tommy's body. What he discovered was shocking. A condom had been inserted into Tommy's body, apparently after her death. The condom contained biological material, but it was too degraded to provide useful DNA evidence. However, the presence of this planted evidence was significant for other reasons. The planting of false evidence inside a murder victim's body represented a level of post-mortem violation and manipulation that was almost unheard of in criminal investigations. It suggested a killer who was not only violent and ruthless, but also calculating enough to attempt to frame an innocent person for the crime. Investigators realized that whoever had planted this evidence had intimate knowledge of the investigation. and had been following its progress closely. They also realized that the anonymous letters, rather than helping to solve the case, were actually part of an elaborate attempt to misdirect it. The sophistication of the frame job suggested that the killer had help, someone else who was willing to participate in the cover-up and the attempt to implicate an innocent person. This realization expanded the investigation to include other potential accomplices. As investigators dug deeper into the evidence, they began to focus more intently on Brad Ray and his potential accomplices. The anonymous letters were subjected to forensic analysis, including handwriting comparison and DNA testing from saliva on the envelope seals. The investigation revealed that Brad had an identical twin brother, Brett Ree, who lived in another state. Phone records showed extensive communications between the brothers in the weeks following Tammy's murder, calls that had not been mentioned during Brad's interviews with police. When investigators interviewed Brett Ree, they found a man who was nervous and evasive, clearly uncomfortable with the questions being asked. Under pressure, Brett eventually admitted that Brad had contacted him after the murder, asking for help in covering up the crime. According to Brett's eventual confession, Brad had called him in a panic, admitting to killing Tommy and asking for help in making it look like someone else was responsible. Brett, despite his initial reluctance, had agreed to help his twin brother avoid punishment for the murder. It was Brett who had written and mailed the anonymous letters. Following a script that Brad had provided, the information in the letters came directly from Brad, who had intimate knowledge of the crime scene and the investigation's progress. The collaboration between the brothers in attempting to frame Brian Clark for Tommy's murder added another layer of callousness to an already horrific crime. Not only had Brad murdered his wife in a fit of jealous rage, but he had then tried to destroy the life of the man she had been involved with. With Brett's cooperation, investigators were able to build a comprehensive case against Brad. The physical evidence from the crime scene, combined with Brad's inconsistent statements and the evidence of his attempt to frame another person, painted a clear picture of guilt. Brad Ree's trial for the murder of his wife began in 2007, nearly a year after Tommy's death. The proceedings drew significant attention from the local community, where the case had been the subject of intense speculation and discussion. The prosecution, led by then Hughes County Prosecutor Todd Love, presented a methodical case built on both physical evidence and the testimony of witnesses who could speak to Brad's behavior before, during, and after the murder. The evidence presented at trial painted a picture of a marriage in crisis, a husband consumed by jealousy over his wife's affair, and a man who had planned and executed not only a murder but an elaborate scheme to avoid responsibility for his crime. Prosecutors described the attack on Tommy as very vengeful, very rageful, emphasizing the excessive nature of the violence that had been inflicted on her. The more than 36 stab wounds spoke to a killer who had been driven by an almost uncontrollable fury, someone who had continued attacking his victim long after she was dead. The prosecution also presented evidence of Brad's attempts to manipulate the investigation, including his collaboration with his twin brother in writing the anonymous letters and planting false evidence. This aspect of the case was particularly damaging to Brad's defense, as it showed premeditation and a callous disregard for the truth. Brad's defense team faced an almost impossible task. The physical evidence against their client was overwhelming, and his own actions in the aftermath of the murder had severely damaged his credibility. They attempted to present alternative theories of the crime, suggesting that other individuals might have been responsible, but these arguments were undermined by the strength of the prosecution's case. Throughout the trial, Brad maintained his innocence, but his credibility had been so thoroughly destroyed by his own actions that the jury found his denials unpersuasive. As the evidence mounted against him and his conviction seemed increasingly certain, Brad Ree made a decision that shocked everyone involved in the case. In a desperate attempt to avoid responsibility for his wife's murder, he claimed that his 12-year-old stepdaughter, Haley, was the real killer. According to Brad's new story, he had discovered Haley standing over her mother's body with a bloody knife, and he had only disposed of Tommy's body to protect the child from prosecution. This claim was so outrageous, so clearly a fabrication designed to save himself, that it actually worked against him by demonstrating the lengths to which he would go to avoid accountability. The idea that a 12-year-old girl could have inflicted the massive injuries found on Tommy's body was medically and physically implausible. The force required to inflict more than 36 stab wounds, including some that went completely through Tommy's torso, was beyond what a child of Haley's size and strength could have generated. Moreover, investigators had found no evidence whatsoever to support Brad's claim. There were no fingerprints, no blood evidence, no witnesses, and no motive that would explain why Haley would want to harm her beloved mother. The attempt to blame his stepdaughter for the murder was seen by prosecutors, investigators, and ultimately the jury as the final proof of Brad Ray's character. Here was a man who had not only murdered his wife in a jealous rage, but was willing to destroy the life of an innocent child to save himself from the consequences of his actions. Haley herself was called to testify against her stepfather, a traumatic experience for a child who had already lost her mother and was now being blamed for her death by the man who was supposed to protect her. Her testimony was heartbreaking but clear. She had not harmed her mother and had been asleep in her room when the murder took place. On March 6, 2007, Brad Ray was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of his wife, Tommy. The jury's decision was unanimous, reflecting the strength of the evidence against him and their rejection of his various attempts to avoid responsibility for the crime. The judge sentenced Brad to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum penalty available under South Dakota law at the time. In delivering the sentence, the judge noted the particular cruelty of the crime and Brad's attempts to blame others, including an innocent child, for his actions. For Tommy's family and friends, the conviction brought a measure of justice, though it could never truly compensate for their loss. Haley, who had lost her mother and watched her stepfather try to destroy her life as well, would have to find a way to move forward despite the trauma she had experienced. The case had revealed the depths of human depravity and the lengths to which someone will go when consumed by jealousy and rage. It also demonstrated the importance of thorough investigation and the dangers of accepting things at face value, especially when dealing with someone capable of such elaborate deception. Brad Ray's attempts to frame Brian Clark for the murder had nearly succeeded in destroying the life of an innocent man. Only the dedicated work of investigators and the eventual cooperation of Brad's twin brother had prevented this miscarriage of justice. Brad Ray would spend the next 17 years in the South Dakota State Penitentiary, serving his life sentence while maintaining his innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. He pursued various appeals over the years, all of which were unsuccessful. On February 18, 2024, Brad Ray died in the prison infirmary at the age of 64. Prison officials did not release the cause of death, but his passing marked the end of a chapter in a story that had traumatized a community and destroyed multiple lives. Tommy Ray, the vibrant woman who had simply wanted to find happiness and fulfillment in her life, had been dead for 18 years by the time her killer drew his final breath. She had missed watching her daughter grow up, graduate from school, and build a life of her own. Haley, who had been just 12 years old when she lost her mother and was falsely accused by her stepfather, had grown into a young woman who had found the strength to rebuild her life despite the trauma of her childhood. She had become an advocate for domestic violence awareness, using her painful experience to help others who had found themselves in similar situations. The case of Tommy Ray serves as a reminder of the dangers that can lurk within seemingly ordinary families, and the devastating consequences when jealousy and possessiveness turn violent. It also demonstrates the importance of supporting survivors of domestic violence, and ensuring that those who commit such crimes are held accountable for their actions. In the end, justice was served, but at a tremendous cost to all involved. The story of Tommy Ray is one of love betrayed, trust violated, and a life cut tragically short by the very person who should have protected it. And so we come to the end of this tragic tale from the plains of South Dakota. Tommy Ray's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from strangers in the night, but from those closest to us. Her memory lives on in her daughter, and in the lives of those who knew and loved her. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight we'll journey into a case that shocked the quiet community of Greer, South Carolina. This is the story of Christina Purcell, a 41-year-old veterinary technician whose life was cut tragically short in October 2021, in a crime scene so unusual that investigators would never forget the haunting image that awaited them. Christina Purcell lived what many would consider an ordinary life in the suburbs of Greer, South Carolina. At 41, she had built a quiet existence working as a veterinary technician, caring for animals with the same gentle nature that defined her personality. Those who knew Christina described her as someone who radiated kindness, always ready to help a friend or neighbor, always putting others' needs before her own. Her small home on Canebrake Drive was her sanctuary, a place where she found solace after long days at the veterinary clinic. The neighborhood itself was the kind of place where people knew each other's names, where children rode bicycles in the early evening light, and where violent crimes seemed like something that happened in distant cities, not in their peaceful community. But Christina's life hadn't always been simple. Like many people, she had experienced her share of challenges and complicated relationships. She had been involved in various legal disputes over the years, including custody matters that had created tension with certain individuals in her life. These complications, however, seemed manageable, the kinds of problems that adults face and work through over time. On that fateful October evening in 2021, Christina returned home from work as she did every day. She parked her car in the driveway, walked up the familiar path to her front door, and stepped inside, completely unaware that her life was about to end in the most brutal and bewildering way imaginable. It was October 2021 when concerned friends and family members realized they hadn't heard from Christina in longer than usual. Phone calls went unanswered, text messages remained unread, and her absence from work raised immediate alarm bells among her colleagues at the veterinary clinic. Christina was nothing if not reliable, and her sudden disappearance from all normal activities was completely out of character. When police officers arrived at the modest home on Canebrake Drive to conduct a welfare check, they had no idea they were about to encounter one of the most disturbing crime scenes in the area's recent memory. The house appeared normal from the outside, a typical suburban home with a small front yard and quiet street appeal. But as officers made their way inside, they discovered a scene that would haunt investigators for years to come. Christina Parcell lay dead in her home, the victim of an incredibly violent attack. She had been stabbed more than 30 times, with wounds concentrated around her head, neck, and jugular vein. The brutality of the assault spoke to a level of rage and personal animosity that investigators rarely encounter. But perhaps most disturbing of all was what surrounded her body. Scattered around Christina's remains were rose petals, or more precisely, dead-headed roses, creating an eerie, almost ritualistic appearance to the crime scene. The petals formed a haunting border around her body, as though someone had taken time after the violent attack to arrange this macabre display. It was this detail that would give the case its infamous name, the rose petal murder. The scene suggested that after killing Christina in what appeared to be a frenzied attack, her murderer had dragged her body to a front room of the house, and carefully posed her, then sprinkled the rose petals around her form. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or a burglary gone wrong. This was personal, deliberate, and deeply disturbing. Detective Blake Wolf of the Greenville County Sheriff's Office took the lead on what would become one of the most perplexing cases of his career. The rose petal murder, as it quickly became known, presented numerous challenges from the very beginning. The brutal nature of the attack suggested someone with deep personal animosity toward Christina, but the staged nature of the scene with the scattered rose petals indicated a level of planning and symbolism that investigators couldn't immediately understand. The first step in any homicide investigation is to examine the victim's personal relationships and recent activities. Investigators began by interviewing Christina's family members, friends, co-workers, and anyone else who might have had contact with her in the days leading up to her death. They reviewed her phone records, examined her social media presence, and tried to piece together a timeline of her final days. What they discovered was that Christina had indeed been involved in various legal disputes, including custody battles and other civil matters that had created tension in her life. However, none of these conflicts seemed to rise to the level that would typically result in such extreme violence. The people closest to Christina, her family members, her co-workers at the veterinary clinic, her neighbors, all expressed shock and bewilderment at her murder. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months, as investigators followed every lead, interviewed every possible suspect, and examined every piece of physical evidence they could find. The case generated significant media attention, both locally and nationally, but despite the public interest and the dedication of law enforcement, the investigation seemed to hit dead end after dead end. The rose petals remained a particularly puzzling element. Investigators consulted with forensic psychologists and criminal profilers, trying to understand what the killer might have been trying to communicate with this strange ritual. Some theorized it could represent love turned to hatred. Others suggested it might be a symbol of death or mourning, but without a suspect, these interpretations remain nothing more than educated guesses. For nearly 3 years, the Christina Purcell murder remained unsolved, becoming one of those cases that haunts investigators and keeps them awake at night. Wondering what they might have missed, the file remained active, but with no new leads and no suspects, it seemed destined to join the ranks of cold cases that plague police departments across the country. But sometimes, justice arrives in the most unexpected ways. In 2024, investigators decided to run the DNA evidence collected from Christina's fingernails through the National DNA Database. Once again, this wasn't unusual. Cold cases are often revisited as technology improves, and as new profiles are added to the system. What happened next, however, was the break they had been desperately hoping for. The DNA profile from under Christina's fingernails matched a sample in the database. And when investigators saw the name that came up, they could hardly believe their luck. Detective Blake Wolf would later describe the moment as feeling like he had just won the lottery. After nearly 3 years of dead ends and frustration, they finally had a suspect. The name that appeared on their computer screen was Zachary Hughes, a 29-year-old man with an unusual background that made him an unlikely murder suspect. Hughes was a classically trained pianist who had studied at the prestigious Juilliard School in New York City. He was known in the Greenville area as a talented musician who had been scheduled to perform with the Greenville Symphony Orchestra before the COVID-19 pandemic canceled the event. Even more surprising was that Hughes appeared to have no criminal record and no known relationship with Christina Purcell. This wasn't a case of domestic violence or a dispute between acquaintances gone wrong. On the surface, it seemed that a complete stranger had entered Christina's home and brutally murdered her for reasons that remained completely unclear. Zachary Hughes presented a profile that defied typical expectations for a violent criminal. Born and raised in the Greenville area, he had shown exceptional musical talent from an early age, eventually earning admission to the Juilliard School, one of the most competitive and prestigious music conservatories in the world. Those who knew Hughes described him as quiet, talented, and dedicated to his craft. After his time at Juilliard, Hughes had returned to South Carolina, where he worked as a classical pianist and occasionally took on other jobs to supplement his income. One of these jobs involved house cleaning, which is how he had come to know a man named John Mello in 2020. This connection would prove to be the key that unlocked the motive behind Christina's murder. When investigators began digging deeper into Hughes's background and his connection to the victim, they discovered a complex web of relationships that wasn't immediately apparent. While Hughes and Christina had never met directly, they were connected through John Mello, who had hired Hughes to clean his house and who had his own complicated legal history with Christina. The investigation revealed that Christina had been involved in custody disputes related to John Mello, and that these legal battles had created significant stress and animosity. What investigators theorized was that Hughes had somehow inserted himself into this custody battle, taking Mello's side against Christina in a dispute that had nothing to do with him personally. This theory would suggest that Hughes had developed such a strong loyalty to his employer, John Mello, that he was willing to commit murder to eliminate what he perceived as a threat to Mello's interests in the custody case. It was a motive that seemed almost incomprehensible to those who knew Hughes as a quiet, artistic person, but it was the only explanation that fit the evidence. When law enforcement officers arrived to arrest Zachary Hughes, he was at his residence in downtown Greenville, living the quiet life of a classical musician that he had maintained throughout the years since Christina's murder. The arrest came as a complete shock to Hughes's neighbors and acquaintances, who found it difficult to reconcile the image of the gentle pianist they knew with the brutal crime he was accused of committing. Hughes was taken into custody without incident and charged with murder in connection with Christina Purcell's death. The evidence against him seemed overwhelming. His DNA under the victim's fingernails placed him at the scene and suggested that Christina had fought for her life, scratching her attacker in the process. Initially, Hughes maintained his innocence, but as the case moved through the legal system and the evidence continued to mount, something unexpected happened. During his trial, in a moment that shocked everyone in the courtroom, Zachary Hughes made a confession that would change everything. In the middle of the proceedings, Hughes admitted to killing Christina Purcell, but his confession came with claims that added even more complexity to an already bewildering case. Hughes claimed that his actions had been motivated by a desire to protect a child who was somehow connected to the custody disputes that had entangled Christina's life. This confession was stunning not only because it came in the middle of the trial, but also because it led to additional arrests. Hughes's admission implicated others in what prosecutors described as a conspiracy, suggesting that Christina's murder may not have been the work of one disturbed individual, but rather the result of a group of people who had decided that eliminating her was the solution to their legal problems. The trial of Zachary Hughes unfolded in a Greenville County courthouse, drawing significant media attention and public interest from around the country. The case had captured national attention not only because of the unusual circumstances surrounding the murder, but also because of the stark contrast between the defendant's background as a Juilliard-trained musician and the brutal nature of the crime he had committed. During the trial, prosecutors presented a methodical case that painted Hughes as a cold-blooded killer who had targeted Christina Parcell not for any personal grievance, but because he had developed an obsessive loyalty to John Mello and viewed Christina as an obstacle to Mello's interests in their ongoing custody dispute. The evidence presented was comprehensive and damning. The DNA found under Christina's fingernails was matched definitively to Hughes, placing him at the scene during the violent struggle that ended her life. Crime scene investigators testified about the 31 stab wounds that had killed Christina, describing the level of force and rage required to inflict such damage. Perhaps most chilling was the testimony about the rose petals that had been scattered around Christina's body. Prosecutors argued that this wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but rather a premeditated murder followed by a deliberate attempt to stage the scene in a way that would confuse investigators and perhaps send some kind of symbolic message. The defense team faced an almost impossible task in trying to explain away the DNA evidence and Hughes's own confession. They attempted to argue that Hughes had acted in what he believed were the best interests of a child, claiming that he had been motivated by a desire to protect rather than by malice. However, this argument struggled to gain traction in the face of the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and the extreme brutality of the attack. Witness after witness took the stand to testify about the impact of Christina's death on her family, friends, and community. They described a woman who had dedicated her life to caring for others, first as a veterinary technician helping injured and sick animals, and always as a friend and family member who put others' needs before her own. After hearing all the evidence and witness testimony, the jury in Zachary Hughes's trial deliberated for only a brief period before reaching their verdict. In February 2025, nearly 4 years after Christina Parcell's brutal murder, Hughes was found guilty on multiple charges, including murder in the first degree. The swiftness of the jury's deliberations suggested that despite the defense's attempts to present mitigating circumstances, the evidence against Hughes was simply too overwhelming to dispute. The DNA evidence, the confession, and the brutal nature of the crime had painted a clear picture of guilt that the jury found impossible to ignore. During the sentencing phase of the trial, family members and friends of Christina Parcell were given the opportunity to address the court and share how her death had impacted their lives. Their victim impact statements painted a picture of a woman whose loss had left an enormous hole in the lives of everyone who knew her. Judge sentenced Zachary Hughes to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his days behind bars for his crime. The sentence brought a measure of closure to Christina's loved ones, though nothing could truly heal the wounds left by her senseless death. The judge, in delivering the sentence, noted the particularly heinous nature of the crime and the fact that Hughes had targeted an innocent woman who had done nothing to deserve the violence visited upon her. The presence of the rose petals at the scene, the judge observed, added a level of cruelty and calculation that made the crime even more disturbing. Even with Zachary Hughes convicted and sentenced, many questions about the Christina Parcell murder remain unanswered. The full extent of the conspiracy that Hughes's confession had revealed was still being investigated, with additional arrests made in connection with the case. The relationship between Hughes and John Mello, and exactly how Hughes had become so invested in Mello's custody disputes that he was willing to commit murder, remains somewhat mysterious. Investigators continued to work to understand the psychological dynamics that had led a talented classical musician with no history of violence to become a brutal killer. For the residents of Greer, South Carolina, Christina's murder had shattered their sense of security in a way that would take years to heal. The idea that someone could be murdered in their quiet suburban neighborhood by a stranger acting on behalf of someone else's interests was profoundly disturbing to a community that had always prided itself on being safe and close-knit. The case also raised broader questions about how civil disputes and custody battles can sometimes spiral into violence when combined with mental instability and obsessive personality traits. While most custody disputes are resolved through the legal system without anyone being physically harmed, Christina's case served as a tragic reminder that the emotions and loyalties involved in such conflicts can sometimes lead to unthinkable consequences. As we come to the end of this tragic tale, it's important to remember that beyond the shocking details of the crime and the unusual circumstances of the investigation, this story is fundamentally about the loss of a human life. Christina Parcell was more than just a victim in a true crime story. She was a daughter, a friend, a colleague, and a member of a community that valued her presence and mourned her absence. Those who knew Christina remember her as someone who brought light into their lives through her kindness and generosity. Her work as a veterinary technician reflected her natural compassion and her desire to help creatures who couldn't help themselves. Her friends and family described someone who was always ready to lend a hand, offer a kind word, or provide support during difficult times. The rose petals that surrounded her body in death, intended by her killer to send some unknowable message, have instead become a symbol of the beauty and fragility of life itself. Like rose petals, our time here is precious and brief. And Christina's story reminds us to cherish the relationships and connections that make life meaningful. In the years since her death, Christina's loved ones have worked to keep her memory alive through acts of kindness and service that reflect the values she embodied during her life. They have established memorial funds to help animals in need, volunteered at local charities, and worked to support other families who have lost loved ones to violence. The case of Christina Parcell, forever known as the Rose Petal Murder, stands as one of the most unusual and disturbing crimes in recent South Carolina history. It serves as a reminder that evil can sometimes emerge from the most unexpected places, and that the connections between people can sometimes lead to tragic consequences that no one could have predicted. The image of those rose petals scattered around Christina's body will forever haunt the investigators who worked on the case. But it will also serve as a reminder of their dedication to seeking justice for victims of violent crime. Detective Blake Wolf and his colleagues never gave up on finding Christina's killer, and their persistence ultimately led to a conviction that brought some measure of peace to her loved ones. Or Zachary Hughes, the talented pianist who threw away his life and career to commit an act of senseless violence. The story ends with a life sentence in prison. His fall from promise to infamy serves as a cautionary tale about how quickly a life can be derailed by poor choices and twisted loyalties. But perhaps most importantly, Christina's story serves as a reminder to all of us about the preciousness of life and the importance of treating each other with kindness and respect. In a world where conflicts and disagreements are inevitable, her death reminds us that violence is never the answer, and that the consequences of our actions extend far beyond ourselves. As you settle into sleep tonight, carry with you not the darkness of this crime, but the light that Christina brought into the world during her 41 years of life. Remember her compassion for animals, her kindness to friends, and her dedication to helping others. Let her story inspire you to live with greater empathy, to resolve conflicts peacefully, and to cherish the relationships that make life worth living. The Rose Petal murder may have been solved and justice served, but Christina Parcell's legacy lives on in the hearts of those who knew her, and in the reminder she provides that every life has value, every person deserves safety and respect, and every act of kindness matters. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we journey to Independence, Missouri, a quiet suburb of Kansas City, where beneath the surface of a seemingly perfect community, secrets, betrayal, and ultimately murder would shatter the lives of everyone involved. This is the story of Randy Stone, a former Marine, devoted father, successful businessman, and pillar of his church community. It's also the story of how love can turn to obsession, how trust can be weaponized, and how the most sacred bonds can become the deadliest traps. So as we settle in, let me tell you about a case that would rock a small Missouri town to its very core. Randy Stone embodied everything Americans admire in a man. Born and raised in the Kansas City area, he had served his country with honor as a United States Marine, carrying himself with the quiet confidence and discipline that military service instills. At 42 years old in 2010, Randy had successfully transitioned from military life to civilian success, building a thriving farmers insurance agency in Independence, Missouri. Randy wasn't just successful in business. He was the kind of man who made his community better simply by being part of it. He coached youth basketball, wrote poetry in his spare time, and could often be found on Sunday mornings driving the church bus for New Hope Baptist Church, ensuring that children from families without transportation could attend Sunday school. His friends and neighbors described him as tough when he needed to be, but with a heart of gold that showed in everything he did. Teresa Stone had known Randy since they were children, growing up in the same northeast Kansas City neighborhoods. But their romantic story didn't begin until 1990, when Randy returned from active duty service with the Marines. Teresa was described by those who knew her as beautiful and vivacious, someone who naturally drew attention wherever she went. She had a flirtatious personality that some found charming, though others would later say it should have been a warning sign. When Randy and Teresa married, they seemed like the perfect couple. 2 kids followed, children who would grow up thinking they had the most stable, loving family imaginable. The Stones ran their insurance business together, with Teresa helping Randy manage the day-to-day operations of their farmer's insurance office. They were deeply involved in their church, attending New Hope Baptist Church regularly, participating in church functions, and contributing both their time and money to the congregation. And from the outside, Randy and Teresa Stone had achieved the American dream. They owned a successful business, lived in a nice home, were raising 2 healthy children, and were active members of their faith community. Randy would often be seen around Independence coaching kids' basketball teams, or helping neighbors with various projects. Teresa was known for her involvement in church activities, and her striking appearance that made her stand out in any crowd. But as we know all too well in stories like this, appearances can be deceiving. Behind the facade of their perfect life, cracks were beginning to form in the Stone marriage. Cracks that would eventually become chasms, and those chasms would become the foundation for murder. Every church has its spiritual leader, the person congregants turn to for guidance, comfort, and moral direction. At New Hope Baptist Church, that man was Pastor David Love. On the surface, Pastor Love seemed like exactly what a growing congregation needed. Charismatic, engaging, and seemingly devoted to his calling. He had that particular combination of authority and approachability that made people want to confide in him, to trust him with their deepest concerns and most personal struggles. But David Love harbored secrets of his own, secrets that would make him perhaps the most dangerous person Randy Stone could have trusted with his family's spiritual welfare. Love had what some might charitably call a troubled past, though that phrase hardly captures the magnitude of the issues that should have disqualified him from any position of trust, let alone spiritual leadership. His personal history was marked by patterns of behavior that, had they been fully known to his congregation, would have sent families running from New Hope Baptist Church as fast as they could manage. The pastor had struggled with appropriate boundaries throughout his career in ministry. There had been whispers and concerns in previous congregations, the kind of quiet concerns that often get brushed aside when a charismatic leader is bringing in new members and growing the church's influence in the community. These weren't just minor personality quirks or leadership style differences. They were fundamental character flaws that made David Love unsuitable for any position where people would trust him with their vulnerability. But none of this was widely known when Love took over leadership at New Hope Baptist. To most of his congregation, including Randy Stone, Pastor Love seemed like a blessing. He was dynamic in the pulpit, engaging in personal conversations, and appeared to care deeply about the spiritual and personal welfare of his flock. Randy Stone, with his military background and straightforward personality, initially appreciated Pastor Love's direct communication style and apparent dedication to the church. Randy became increasingly involved in church activities, partly because of his own faith, but also because Pastor Love specifically encouraged his participation. The pastor made Randy feel valued and important within the church community, praising his volunteer work, his financial contributions, and his steady presence as a family man. Teresa Stone also found herself drawn to Pastor Love, but in ways that neither she nor Randy initially recognized as dangerous. The pastor had a way of making people feel special, of making them believe that he understood them in ways that others, even their spouses, might not. He was an excellent listener, someone who seemed to care deeply about personal struggles and individual needs. What Randy didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that his pastor was already beginning to see his wife, not as a congregant to shepherd, but as a target for seduction. Pastor Love was studying Teresa Stone, the way a predator studies prey, learning her vulnerabilities, her dissatisfactions, and the exact words and actions that would make her feel appreciated and understood. The foundation for betrayal was being laid with every conversation, every moment of seeming pastoral care, every instance where Pastor Love positioned himself as someone who truly understood Teresa Stone in ways that perhaps her busy, work-focused husband did not. Adultery rarely begins with dramatic declarations of love or sudden passionate encounters. More often, it starts with seemingly innocent conversations, with someone making you feel heard and appreciated in ways you've been missing. This was exactly how Pastor David Love began his systematic seduction of Teresa Stone. It started, as these things often do, with pastoral counseling. Teresa approached Pastor Love about some personal concerns, perhaps struggles in her marriage, feelings of being taken for granted, or simply the ordinary stresses of running a business while raising children. These were the kinds of concerns that any married person might discuss with their spiritual advisor, looking for guidance and perspective. But Pastor Love had no intention of helping Teresa strengthen her marriage or find peace within her current life. Instead, he began a calculated campaign to make her feel special, understood, and increasingly dependent on his emotional support. The conversations grew longer and more personal. Pastor Love made it clear that he was always available to Teresa, that her concerns were his priority, that her happiness mattered to him in ways that went beyond normal pastoral care. He began suggesting that her problems weren't really her fault, that perhaps she wasn't getting the appreciation and attention she deserved at home. These sessions moved beyond the church office. Pastor Love began calling Teresa for personal conversations, suggesting coffee meetings to discuss her spiritual growth, and finding reasons to spend time with her away from the congregation. He was careful at first, always maintaining plausible religious or church-related reasons for their interactions. Teresa, like many people who find themselves targeted by manipulative individuals, initially felt grateful for the attention. Pastor Love seemed to understand her in ways that Randy focused on building their business and managing his many community commitments perhaps did not. The pastor listened to her complaints without judgments, validated her feelings, and made her feel like the most important person in his world. What Teresa didn't recognize was that she was experiencing a textbook seduction by someone who had likely done this before. Pastor Love knew exactly which emotional buttons to push, exactly how to make her feel special while simultaneously creating distance between her and her husband. He began subtly criticizing Randy, not directly, but through concerned comments about whether Randy truly appreciated what an amazing woman he had married. The emotional affair deepened over months. Pastor Love convinced Teresa that what they shared was special, unique, and spiritually meaningful. He suggested that their connection was somehow divinely inspired, that God had brought them together for a purpose. This spiritual manipulation is particularly insidious because it reframes betrayal as righteousness, adultery as a form of divine calling. By the time their relationship became physical, Teresa was already emotionally invested in a way that made rational decision-making nearly impossible. Pastor Love had successfully isolated her from her support systems, convinced her that her marriage was unfulfilling, and positioned himself as the answer to all her emotional needs. Randy Stone remained completely unaware of what was happening. He trusted his pastor implicitly and had no reason to suspect that the man he looked up to spiritually was systematically destroying his marriage. Randy continued his volunteer work at the church, continued his financial contributions, and continued to view Pastor Love as a blessing in their lives. The affair would continue for nearly 10 years, hidden from Randy but consuming both Teresa and Pastor Love, with an intensity that would eventually demand a resolution neither of them was emotionally prepared to handle in any healthy way. 10 years. A decade of living a lie, of maintaining a facade while carrying on one of the most devastating betrayals imaginable. Teresa Stone and Pastor David Love conducted their affair with the kind of careful planning usually reserved for military operations or complex business transactions. The logistics alone were staggering. Randy and Teresa worked together daily at their insurance office. They attended the same church every Sunday, where Teresa would sit with her family while making eye contact with her lover in the pulpit. They participated in church functions together, attended social events together, and maintained the appearance of a committed, faith-based marriage. While Teresa was emotionally and physically committed to another man, Pastor Love was equally skilled at maintaining his double life. He continued his pastoral duties, counseling other couples about marital problems, performing weddings, and preaching sermons about faithfulness and moral living. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain such deception speaks to a level of compartmentalization that suggests either extraordinary self-deception or sociopathic indifference to the harm being caused. The affair intensified over time rather than cooling, as many long-term affairs do. Teresa and Pastor Love became increasingly obsessed with each other, spending countless hours on the phone, exchanging messages, and finding ways to meet privately. They developed the kind of all-consuming passion that often develops when two people are sharing a secret that could destroy everything they've built in their public lives. But this intensity created its own problems. The more deeply Teresa fell in love with Pastor Love, the more difficult it became to maintain her marriage to Randy. She began to resent her husband not for anything he had done, but simply for existing, for being the obstacle between her and the man she believed was her true love. Pastor Love fed this resentment. He encouraged Teresa to see Randy as selfish, unappreciative, and unworthy of her. He suggested that Randy was holding her back from true happiness, that her marriage was preventing her from fulfilling her divine purpose. This kind of psychological manipulation is designed to make the victim feel justified in increasingly extreme actions. Randy, meanwhile, continued to live his life with characteristic honor and integrity. He worked hard to build their business, support their family, and contribute to their community. If he noticed changes in Teresa's behavior, and it's hard to imagine that he didn't notice something over the course of 10 years, he likely attributed them to normal life stresses, rather than the complete betrayal of their marriage vows. The church community also remained largely unaware of what was happening. Pastor Love was careful to maintain his public image, and Teresa was skilled at playing the role of devoted wife and mother during public appearances. Their secret was protected by the assumption that spiritual leaders are trustworthy and that faithful church members wouldn't engage in such deception. But secrets this large and this emotionally charged cannot be maintained indefinitely. The psychological pressure of living such an elaborate lie, combined with the increasing intensity of their obsession with each other, was building toward a crisis that would demand resolution. Teresa later admitted to investigators that she had reached a point where she just wanted Randy out of her life. The man who had loved her, supported her, built a life with her, and fathered her children had become nothing more than an obstacle to her happiness. She no longer saw Randy as a person with feelings, dreams, and a right to exist. She saw him only as a problem that needed to be solved. It was this dehumanization of Randy Stone that would make what happened next not only possible, but feel necessary to two people who had lost all moral compass in their obsession with each other. By 2010, Teresa Stone and Pastor David Love had reached a psychological point of no return. Their 10-year affair had evolved from passionate secret romance to desperate obsession, and both had become so emotionally invested in their relationship that they could no longer run their life without each other. But there was one insurmountable obstacle to their happiness: Randy Stone. Teresa had grown to see her husband as nothing more than an impediment to her true love. The man who had served his country, built a successful business, and devoted himself to his family and community, was now viewed by his own wife as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be honored. The conversations between Teresa and Pastor Love grew increasingly dark. They discussed divorce, but Teresa worried about the financial implications and the impact on her children. She was also concerned about how their affair would be viewed by the church community if it became public through divorce proceedings. Pastor Love, for his part, was equally invested in finding a solution that would allow him to have Teresa without facing the professional and personal consequences of his actions being exposed. As a pastor, he understood that revelation of his decade-long affair with a married congregant would end his career and likely result in his expulsion from the church community that gave his life meaning and structure. It was Teresa who first articulated the unthinkable solution. In conversations with Pastor Love, she began expressing the wish that Randy would simply disappear from their lives permanently. She started with vague statements about wishing he were gone, but gradually became more explicit about what she meant. The progression from wishing someone would disappear to planning their murder is one that reveals the complete moral collapse of everyone involved. Teresa Stone had reached a point where she valued her personal happiness more than her husband's life. Pastor David Love had reached a point where his obsession with Teresa mattered more than his calling, his congregation, or basic human decency. The conversations were no longer hypothetical. Teresa began telling Pastor Love that she wanted Randy dead. Not metaphorically, not as an expression of frustration, but as a literal plan for solving their problem. Text messages and phone records that would later be recovered by investigators revealed the chilling progression of their planning. Teresa made statements like, "I want him dead," and discussed specific methods for accomplishing Randy's murder. Pastor Love didn't discourage these conversations. He encouraged them, offering to be the one to actually carry out the killing. The plan they developed was brutally simple. Pastor Love would go to Randy's insurance office and shoot him. They would make it look like a robbery, ensuring that suspicion wouldn't immediately fall on family members or close associates. Randy would be eliminated. Teresa would inherit his life insurance and business assets. And after a reasonable period of mourning, she and Pastor Love could begin their life together publicly. What's particularly chilling about their planning is how casually they discussed ending the life of a man who had never done anything to deserve such treatment. Randy Stone was guilty of nothing more than trusting the wrong people. His wife and his pastor, the two people who should have been most devoted to his well-being. The psychological transformation required for Teresa to go from loving wife to co-conspirator in murder, and for Pastor Love to go from spiritual counselor to killer, speaks to the destructive power of obsessive passion combined with complete moral collapse. By March 2010, they had moved beyond planning to preparation. The decision had been made, the method had been chosen, and all that remained was selecting the right moment to destroy Randy Stone's life and the lives of his children, who would lose both their father and their mother to this act of ultimate betrayal. Wednesday, March 31st, 2010 began like any other day for Randy Stone. He woke up in the home he shared with Teresa and their two children. Probably had coffee, maybe read the morning news, and prepared for another day at the farmer's insurance office he had built into a successful business. Randy's office was located on Nolan Road in Independence, Missouri, a busy commercial area where he had established himself as a trusted insurance agent over many years. His clients knew him as honest, reliable, and genuinely interested in helping them protect what mattered most to them. The irony that Randy Stone, who made his living helping others prepare for life's unexpected disasters, was completely unprepared for the disaster approaching his own life, would not be lost on those who knew him. That morning, Randy went through his normal routine. He likely had no idea that this would be his last day alive. No sense that the two people he trusted most in the world had spent months planning his murder. He probably spoke with Teresa before leaving for work, maybe discussed dinner plans or weekend activities, completely unaware that his wife was counting the hours until he would be dead. Pastor David Love also went through the motions of a normal day, but his mind was focused on the task ahead. The man who had spent years preaching about love, forgiveness, and the sanctity of life was preparing to commit cold-blooded murder. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain his pastoral duties while planning to kill one of his congregants speaks to a level of moral corruption that is difficult to comprehend. Sometime during the day, Pastor Love made his way to Randy's insurance office. The details of his approach were carefully planned. He needed to ensure that he could get close enough to Randy to guarantee a fatal shot, but also needed to make his escape without being immediately identified as the killer. Randy was at his desk when Pastor Love entered the office. We can only imagine Randy's thoughts in those final moments. Was he surprised to see his pastor? Did he assume this was a social visit or perhaps a church-related matter? Did Pastor Love engage in small talk before pulling out the gun, or did he act immediately? What we know for certain is that Randy Stone was shot once in the head with a .40 caliber handgun at point-blank range. The shot was immediately fatal. Randy died instantly, never knowing that his death had been planned for months by the two people he trusted most. The crime scene told a story that investigators would later piece together with chilling precision. There were no signs of a struggle, indicating that Randy had been taken completely by surprise. The cash drawer was undisturbed, and money was still visible on Randy's desk, immediately ruling out robbery as a motive. A spent .40 caliber casing was found at the scene, providing crucial ballistic evidence that would later tie Pastor Love to the murder. Pastor Love left the scene quickly, but not before ensuring that Randy was dead. He had crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. He had taken the life of an innocent man to satisfy his own selfish desires. Randy Stone's body was discovered later that day, sending shockwaves through the Independence community. A former Marine, successful businessman, devoted father, and active church member had been murdered in his own office. The randomness and brutality of it seemed incomprehensible to everyone who knew him. Teresa Stone received the call about her husband's death and immediately rushed to the scene, playing the role of devastated widow with apparent conviction. She wept, she appeared distraught, and she accepted the comfort and condolences of friends, family, and church members who had no idea they were comforting Randy's murderer. Pastor David Love also appeared at the scene, offering spiritual comfort to Teresa and the children, praying with the family and helping to coordinate the church's response to this tragedy. He counseled Teresa through her grief, held prayer services for Randy's soul, and spoke movingly at Randy's funeral about what a good man he had been. The audacity of Pastor Love's behavior in the aftermath of the murder is staggering. He not only killed Randy Stone, he then used Randy's death as an opportunity to further ingratiate himself with Teresa, and to solidify his position as the family's spiritual counselor during their time of loss. But murder, unlike adultery, leaves evidence, and investigators and independents were about to begin an investigation that would eventually expose the full scope of Teresa and Pastor Love's betrayal. Detective work in murder cases often begins with the assumption that the victim knew their killer. Statistics show that people are most likely to be murdered by someone close to them, a family member, friend, or associate. This principle would prove crucial in the Randy Stone investigation, though it would take time for investigators to uncover the full truth. The initial crime scene analysis immediately ruled out random robbery. Randy's office showed no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and nothing of value had been taken. The cash on his desk was undisturbed, and his wallet was untouched. This meant that Randy had likely been killed by someone he knew and trusted, someone who could get close enough to shoot him at point-blank range without causing alarm. The .40 caliber casing found at the scene would prove to be crucial evidence. But ballistic analysis takes time, and investigators first needed to identify suspects before they could match the bullet to a specific weapon. Randy's personal life initially seemed to offer few clues. He was described by everyone interviewed as a good man, devoted to his family, successful in his business, active in his church, and well-respected in his community. He had no known enemies, no business disputes serious enough to motivate murder, and no involvement in any activities that might have put him at risk. Teresa Stone, as the victim's widow, was initially treated with the sympathy and consideration typically shown to grieving family members. She appeared devastated by her husband's death, wept during interviews, and seemed genuinely shocked that anyone would want to harm Randy. Her grief appeared authentic to investigators who had no reason to suspect that she might be involved in her husband's murder. The church community also rallied around Teresa and her children, providing meals, childcare, and emotional support during their time of loss. Pastor David Love was particularly attentive, spending countless hours counseling Teresa through her grief and helping to coordinate the church's response to the tragedy. But experienced investigators know that appearances can be deceiving, and they began looking more closely at Randy's personal relationships. They conducted extensive interviews with family members, business associates, church members, and friends, trying to identify anyone who might have had a motive to kill Randy Stone. It was during these interviews that investigators began to hear whispers, subtle hints that perhaps all was not as perfect in the Stone marriage as it appeared. Nothing concrete at first, just comments that suggested there might have been some marital stress, that Teresa seemed to have been unhappy at times, that she and Randy hadn't seemed as close in recent months as they had been in the past. These whispers led investigators to look more closely at Teresa's activities and associations. They began examining her phone records, her email communications, and her daily routine. They also started paying closer attention to the people who were providing her with comfort and support during her bereavement. Pastor David Love's frequent presence at Teresa's side began to seem less like pastoral care and more like something else entirely. His attention to Teresa appeared to go beyond what would be typical for a minister counseling a grieving widow. He was at her house frequently, spent long hours alone with her, and seemed unusually invested in her emotional state. The investigation also revealed some troubling aspects of Pastor Love's background. His previous ministry positions had ended under circumstances that weren't entirely clear, and there were suggestions of inappropriate behavior with female congregants in the past. None of this proved that he was involved in Randy's murder, but it established that he wasn't the upstanding spiritual leader he appeared to be. As investigators dug deeper into both Teresa and Pastor Love's backgrounds, they began to uncover evidence of financial communications, frequent phone calls, and meetings that had no apparent church-related purpose. The pattern that emerged suggested a relationship that went far beyond pastoral counseling. But the breakthrough in the case would come from an unexpected source: electronic communications that both Teresa and Pastor Love thought had been hidden from investigators. In the age of digital evidence, very few secrets can be kept permanently. The truth about Randy Stone's murder was about to be revealed through the very technology that had helped his killers coordinate their crime. In modern criminal investigations, digital evidence often provides the most compelling proof of guilt. Text messages, emails, phone records, and social media communications create an electronic trail that is nearly impossible to completely erase. For Teresa Stone and Pastor David Love, their reliance on digital communication would prove to be their downfall. Investigators obtained warrants for both Teresa's and Pastor Love's phone records, email accounts, and electronic devices. What they discovered was a treasure trove of evidence that revealed not only the extent of their affair, but also their detailed planning for Randy Stone's murder. The text messages between Teresa and Pastor Love painted a picture of obsessive passion mixed with calculating cruelty. Messages dating back months before Randy's death showed Teresa expressing increasingly violent wishes about her husband. The progression was chilling, from complaints about being unhappy in her marriage to explicit statements about wanting Randy dead. One particularly damning text message from Teresa to Pastor Love read simply, "I want him dead." This wasn't sent in a moment of anger or frustration. It was part of an ongoing conversation about how to solve the Randy problem permanently. The casual tone of these messages revealed how completely both Teresa and Pastor Love had dehumanized Randy, reducing him from a person to an obstacle. Pastor Love's responses to these messages were equally incriminating. Rather than counseling Teresa against such thoughts, as any legitimate spiritual advisor would do, he encouraged her violent fantasies and offered to be the one to carry them out. His messages showed a man who was not only willing to commit murder for love, but who was actively planning the logistics of the crime. The electronic evidence also revealed the extent of their affair, which had been conducted largely through digital communications over the course of nearly a decade. Thousands of messages, emails, and phone calls painted a picture of two people who had become completely obsessed with each other to the exclusion of all moral considerations. Perhaps most disturbing were the messages sent in the immediate aftermath of Randy's murder. While Teresa was publicly playing the role of grieving widow, she and Pastor Love were privately expressing satisfaction that their plan had worked. Their digital communications showed no remorse, no second thoughts, and no concern for Randy's children, who had lost their father to their mother's selfishness. The timing of these communications was particularly damning. Messages planning Randy's death were followed immediately by messages celebrating his death, creating an electronic record that conclusively proved premeditation and conspiracy. Pastor Love's phone records also placed him in the vicinity of Randy's office at the time of the murder. Cell tower data showed his phone moving from his normal locations to the area around Randy's insurance office on the day of the murder, then moving away immediately after the estimated time of death. The investigation also uncovered financial communications between Teresa and Pastor Love, including discussions about Randy's life insurance policies and the business assets Teresa would inherit upon his death. These messages revealed that money, as well as passion, was a motivating factor in their decision to kill Randy. Banking records showed that Teresa had been making unusual inquiries about Randy's life insurance policies in the months before his death, and had even increased some of the coverage amounts without Randy's knowledge. This evidence suggested long-term planning and demonstrated that Teresa had been thinking about Randy's death as a financial opportunity as well as a romantic solution. The cumulative weight of the digital evidence was overwhelming. Every electronic communication device in Teresa and Pastor Love's possession contained evidence of their affair, their conspiracy to commit murder, and their satisfaction with the results of their crime. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the digital evidence was how it revealed the complete moral collapse of both conspirators. These weren't messages sent in moments of passion or temporary insanity. They were calculated, cold-blooded communications between two people who had decided that their happiness was worth more than Randy Stone's life. Armed with this electronic evidence, investigators were ready to make arrests and begin the process of bringing Randy Stone's killers to justice. By early 2011, nearly a year after Randy Stone's murder, investigators had assembled a comprehensive case against both Teresa Stone and Pastor David Love. The digital evidence was overwhelming, the circumstantial evidence was compelling, and the motive was clear. It was time to bring Randy's killers to justice. The arrests, when they came, sent shockwaves through the independence community that were even more devastating than Randy's original murder. The revelation that Teresa Stone had conspired to kill her own husband was difficult enough to comprehend. But the involvement of Pastor David Love created a crisis of faith for the entire New Hope Baptist Church congregation. Teresa Stone was arrested first. In May 2011, the woman who had played the grieving widow for over a year, accepting sympathy and support from friends and family, was taken into custody on charges of conspiracy to commit murder. The arrest was particularly traumatic for her children, who had already lost their father and now learned that their mother was responsible for his death. Pastor David Love was arrested separately on charges of second-degree murder. The man who had preached about love, forgiveness, and moral living was led away in handcuffs, his pastoral career ending in the most dramatic and shameful way possible. Both Teresa and Pastor Love initially maintained their innocence, but the evidence against them was so comprehensive that their legal teams quickly began exploring plea bargain options. The digital communications alone were enough to secure convictions, and both defendants faced the possibility of life in prison if they went to trial and were found guilty. The church community was devastated by the revelations. Members who had trusted Pastor Love with their most personal concerns now learned that he was capable of murder. Families who had looked up to Randy and Teresa Stone as an example of a successful Christian marriage now learned that their marriage had been a facade hiding a decade of adultery and ultimately murder. Many church members reported feeling betrayed, not just by Pastor Love's actions, but by their own inability to see the truth. They wondered how they could have been so blind to what was happening in their own congregation, how they could have been fooled by people they had trusted completely. The broader independence community also struggled to process the revelations. Randy Stone had been genuinely respected and liked, and the discovery that he had been murdered by his own wife and pastor challenged everyone's assumptions about the people they thought they knew. Local media coverage of the arrests and subsequent legal proceedings was extensive, bringing unwanted attention to a community that prided itself on being a quiet, family-friendly suburb of Kansas City. The story had all the elements that make for sensational news coverage: adultery, murder, religious hypocrisy, and betrayal of the most intimate kind. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the arrests was the impact on Randy Stone's children. These young people had lost their father to murder, then learned that their mother was responsible for his death. They faced the prospect of losing both parents, one to murder, the other to prison, because of choices made by adults who were supposed to protect and care for them. The children's situation highlighted the broader devastation caused by Teresa and Pastor Love's actions. Their selfish decisions didn't just end Randy's life. They destroyed the lives of innocent children who had done nothing to deserve such trauma. As both defendants faced the reality of their legal situations, the question became whether they would accept responsibility for their actions, or continue to maintain their innocence in the face of overwhelming evidence. The legal proceedings in the Randy Stone murder case would ultimately result in both conspirators accepting responsibility for their crimes, though their paths to justice took different forms. Pastor David Love, faced with overwhelming evidence, including the ballistic match between the murder weapon and a gun registered to him, chose to accept a plea bargain rather than face trial. In 2011, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The plea agreement likely saved Love from facing first-degree murder charges, which could have resulted in the death penalty in Missouri. However, a life sentence without parole meant that he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, paying for his decision to end Randy Stone's life, to satisfy his own selfish desires. Teresa Stone's legal proceedings took slightly longer, but she too eventually chose to accept responsibility rather than face trial. In April 2012, she pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. The disparity in sentences between Teresa's 8 years and Pastor Love's life sentence reflected their different roles in the crime. While Teresa was clearly the instigator who wanted her husband dead, Pastor Love was the one who actually pulled the trigger. The law recognizes this distinction, though both defendants bore moral responsibility for Randy's death. Teresa's sentencing hearing was particularly emotional, as Randy Stone's children were present to witness their mother being sent to prison. In a remarkable display of forgiveness and maturity, both children actually asked the judge for mercy in their mother's sentencing, despite the fact that her actions had destroyed their family. The children's request for mercy spoke to their character and to the values that Randy Stone had instilled in them during his life. Even faced with the ultimate betrayal by their mother, they showed the kind of compassion and grace that their father would have been proud of. But the legal consequences were only part of the price that Teresa Stone and Pastor David Love would pay for their crimes. Both faced the complete destruction of their reputations, their relationships, and any hope for a normal future. Pastor Love's career in ministry was permanently ended, and his actions cast a shadow over every congregation he had ever served. Church members who had trusted him with their spiritual guidance now questioned everything he had ever taught them, wondering how someone capable of such evil could have appeared so righteous. Teresa Stone faced the loss of her children's trust, her place in the community, and any chance of building a new life after her release from prison. She would forever be known as the woman who conspired to murder her husband, a label that would follow her for the rest of her life. The financial consequences were also significant. Randy's life insurance policies, which had been part of Teresa's motivation for murder, were not paid out to her due to her conviction for conspiracy in his death. Instead, the money went to Randy's children, ensuring that they would have some financial security despite the loss of both parents. The New Hope Baptist Church community faced the difficult task of rebuilding after the scandal that had destroyed their congregation's leadership and shattered their faith in the people they had trusted most. Many members left the church entirely, unable to continue worshiping in a place that had been so thoroughly corrupted by their pastor's actions. The broader independence community also struggled with the aftermath of the case. Randy Stone had been a genuine pillar of the community, and his murder highlighted how vulnerable good people can be to the evil intentions of those closest to them. As we reach the end of this tragic story, it's important to remember that at its heart, this isn't really a story about Teresa Stone or Pastor David Love. This is a story about Randy Stone, a man who lived with honor, served his community with dedication, and loved his family with genuine devotion. Randy Stone was a United States Marine who served his country with pride. He was a successful businessman who built something meaningful in his community. He was a father who raised children with strong values and moral character, as evidenced by their ability to show forgiveness even in the face of unimaginable betrayal. He was a volunteer who coached youth basketball and drove church buses because he believed in making his community better. Randy Stone was also a man who trusted the wrong people, his wife and his pastor, the two individuals who should have been most devoted to his welfare and protection. His trust, which spoke to his character and his faith in human goodness, ultimately cost him his life. But Randy's legacy lived on through his children, who showed remarkable resilience and grace in the face of tragedy. Despite losing their father to murder and their mother to prison, they demonstrated the values Randy had taught them by asking for mercy for the woman who had destroyed their family. The case serves as a sobering reminder that evil can hide behind the most trusted facades, that a pastor can be a predator, that a loving spouse can become a killer, and that the people we trust most completely can be the ones most capable of destroying us. It also reminds us that actions have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate participants. Teresa Stone and Pastor David Love's selfish decisions didn't just end Randy's life. They traumatized innocent children, destroyed a church congregation's faith, and shattered a community's sense of security. Randy Stone deserved better than the betrayal he received from his wife and pastor. He deserved to see his children grow up, to continue building his business and serving his community, and to live out his natural life surrounded by people who truly loved and appreciated him. Instead, Randy Stone's life was cut short at age 42 by two people who valued their own happiness more than his right to exist. His story serves as both a tragedy and a warning, a reminder that we must be careful whom we trust, but also that we must never allow the evil actions of others to diminish our own commitment to living with honor and integrity. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Randy Stone not as a victim, but as an example of how to live well, with service, dedication, love, and trust in the goodness of others, even when that trust is sometimes misplaced. Rest in peace, Randy Stone. Your life mattered, your service was appreciated, and your memory will endure long after your killers are forgotten. Soft, peaceful music fades in as the story concludes. The case of Randy Stone reminds us that behind every true crime story is a real person whose life had meaning, whose loss created ripples of grief and trauma that continue to this day. In remembering these victims, we honor not just their memory, but our own commitment to justice, truth, and the protection of the innocent. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.